I'd like to welcome everybody to our special meeting of the Benicia Unified School District's Board of Directors School Board, and it is April 24th, and it is 9:05 a.m. I'd like to call our meeting to order. At this time, can we do a roll call vote, Mrs. Martinez, please?
Absolutely. President Zeta.
Here.
Trustee Moss.
Here.
Trustee Ferrucci.
Here.
Trustee Grubbs.
Here.
And Trustee Maselli.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to, thank you so much. We're going to move on to the Pledge of Allegiance, and I am going to call on, I was like, I got all these people to call, how about Leslie? Dr. Beatson, would you mind doing the pledge?
Not at all. Everyone, please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much for leading us. We're going to move on to item number 4, and I've been informed that there are no public comments this morning, so we are going to move on to our number 5, which is our study session, which is why we've all gathered here. And I'm going to let Dr. Young tee this up, and we'll be good to go.
Very good. Thank you, President Zeta. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you, and good morning, everybody who may be tuning in and watching us this morning. Today, we're going to spend some time together from 9 to noon talking about equity and opportunity. An important topic for us as a school district, certainly, and it's a national topic, as it should be. So we're spending some time together. I want to thank the board for your commitment to this work. This is our second study session of the year. Not all school boards make this kind of a commitment to the work. And so I want to thank and congratulate you for doing that and taking the time on a Saturday to come together. As Ms. Anderson, who I'll introduce in a moment, reminds us that, it's important for us as a governance team to come together to learn together about the work, because it's complex. Running a school district is complex. There's a myriad issues that we address together, and coming together as a governance team is complex. So thank you for doing that. So I'm going to have Ms. Anderson, who's our facilitator, introduce herself, and then if you could turn it back over to me, and I had a couple of other introductory comments, and then we'll get right into the work. Does that sound good for everybody? All right, Ms. Anderson, good morning. We're glad you're with us.
Good morning. Yes, thanks for having me. I'm honored to hang out with you just for a few hours on your Saturday. Just really appreciate the ability to be present and lock arms with you on your journey, as I'm on my own journey, and with many school boards around the state. Have the pleasure of working with through one of our partners, which is CSBA. I know we've all met in some way, shape, or form, and also have engaged in kind of a network opportunity in Solano County. But I've also am a native of the region. I'm a native of the county. I actually come from what I call humble beginnings, because I had the pleasure of standing on the shoulders of a gentleman named Jesse Bethel. You all may recognize the high school, Bethel High. And so just honored to have started my career in Vallejo, where my grandparents lived, and went through the system as a teacher, was at Vallejo High School as well as an administrator, and then also was at Highland Elementary as a principal. And as some of you we locked arms with through our AXA journey, I got snatched out of what I call the superintendent pipeline when I look back at where I was going, and ended up working at AXA for about 4 years, and had the honor of supporting and leading the equity work around the state for lots of AXA members. And so now fast forward, now a consultant, doing this with lots of districts all over the state. Has been such an honor and a pleasure to work not only with superintendents and boards, but also with site administrators, obviously district administrators, and students, parents, and teachers, which is another phenomenon in our system of engaging them in these conversations too. So it's been a pleasure, and I just appreciate, again, Dr. Young, partnering with you and your cabinet, of course, the board, to really continue to support the work. Also being having children going through Benicia Unified, and we have 3 children actually, so they're all over the map. Like there's one in Berkeley, there's one in Vallejo, there's one in Benicia. And the cool part about that is equity is about finding, what kids need. So I found that like, wow, all 3 of our kids have different needs and what's best for them and what's a good fit. So it's interesting to experience that as a parent as well. So really honored again to hang out with you today. So I know we'll do some real deep dives, but Dr. Young, I'll pass it back over to you to front load a little bit of the work today.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you so much. So Dr. Beatson, could you share the screen? I could talk to those few slides for just a couple of minutes. So again, reminder, I'll go back to that one real quick. Just if you go back to the equity and opportunity conversation. And, this is a conversation that it really isn't new. It's one that, we've been trying to get after as a nation and as a school district and certainly throughout my 35-year career. So it's ongoing work. And it's not just here in Benicia. This is a national work. It's a national conversation. I think the difference, certainly when I think about this work, is there's a tremendous urgency around it that has emerged through, some really serious and devastating events that occurred in our nation, in particular, the murder of George Floyd. And then I think that spawned a lot of urgency around the importance to continue to do equity and opportunity work. So just a quick thought on that. And then the next slide, when we think about this, some categories to think about equity is, as Nicole said, everyone getting what they need. The opportunity piece, a big part of this is trying to remove barriers in a system that gets in the way of students achieving their potential. The thought about inclusivity means all. We serve all of our students, and the culturally responsive practices valuing and honoring each person's strengths, backgrounds, and experiences. Next slide. This is a statement that I came up with because I think about this work and how challenging it is. And a lot of it's very thoughtful, and it will push people to expand their thinking around things. And part of the conversation is, Nicole will remind us that sometimes these conversations can be uncomfortable because they challenge people's belief systems about how they view the world. But when I think about it, I also think we believe our work with equity and opportunity should promote a system, and I believe this strongly, that builds community in ways that are inclusive, hopeful, and inspiring. And the hopeful and inspiring piece for me is when you work through the hard parts of this stuff at the end of the day, it really is hopeful and it really is inspiring because you're elevating the whole system to meet the needs of all of our students as best way that we can. Just a quick reminder on this, there are a lot of words there, but as a board and as a system, I want us to keep remembering that we have this infrastructure of thoughts in place, and certainly we can adjust it as we go forward. I went through a process, I think it was my second year here as your superintendent, had community outreach and a committee that helped work on developing the vision statement, which you see at the top, where all students achieve at their highest potential in an engaging, inspiring, and challenging learning environment. And then on the left, we went through a process of talking about what are the beliefs that a system should have and should share in order to get at that vision statement. I won't read each of those, but if you see the highlighted words, you see things as a system. When we think about our students, we should think about their potential, that we challenge them, that we help them in the pursuit of their passions and talents, that we believe that students are, each one of them, are creative, they're unique, they can, have the capacity to learn and do great things, that we believe that education should be collaborative and an effort with our stakeholders, our students, staff, parents, guardians, the community. Other one in there about student voice. We met with some equity experts yesterday, and they had some interesting thoughts to share with us about student agency. The big one for all school districts is believing that schools should be safe and welcoming, and that systems continually get better through levels of accountability, and then they're purposeful and challenging and certainly innovative. Now, over on the right-hand side, just real quick on that, I was so intrigued by a number of school districts, this was years ago, that had these characteristics, which you see there, of their graduates and what they would like that to look like. So what you see there is, obviously doing the stakeholder outreach when we put that together, but these also represented some research that we did regarding the kinds of qualities that the world of work looks for when our young people enter into the workforce, and also at the university level as well. So you see things in there, and it's a lot. And when I look at these, I say, gosh, am I those things? But we like our students. I won't go through all of them, but they're inquisitive, they're lifelong learners, self-sufficient. We used to talk, and we still should, about the 21st century standards, college and career ready. We talked a lot about, and industry talks a lot about these things, about being collaborative, creative, critical thinkers, excellent communicators, that our young folks that leave us are compassionate, they're respectful, they're integrity, resilient, innovative, entrepreneurial, globally aware, et cetera. So there's a lot in there. And as we go through time, we're certainly can avail ourselves to adjust those. But I think, having that, what's your desired future state? And you think about the students that leave us, we're working towards these elements, these characteristics that we would like them to have. And then certainly, absolutely, the work around equity and opportunity and culturally inclusive practices as a way of thinking is certainly essential to helping us work with our students to achieve those desired characteristics. So I did want to point those out. Those are, guiding artifacts for our system. In the next slide, just real quick, Dr. Beatson always does a terrific job of reviewing these regularly at board meetings. The BUSD's equity journey, and there are a number of things in there that we have been engaged in over time, and we continue to engage in the work around professional development, certainly being at the center, teacher training, setting goals through the LCAP, et cetera. So I just want to remind us that there's a lot of pieces in place that we've worked on that are helping us move this work forward. And then the last slide, I wanted to point out to all of us, we have a document called the LCAP. It's the Local Control Accountability Plan, which also functions as the district's strategic plan, that those two documents are fused together to serve that singular purpose. And there's 4 goals in it. I think one of them is around social emotional development of our students, which is a very big focus for the district. Performance around mathematics and English language arts. And then a single goal standing alone around the work around equity. And I wanted to make sure that I pointed that out to us, because under this goal, there are measurables and deliverables, if you will. There's actions and then ways to measure the district's movement forward in this. So I just want to remind us that this is a big part of the work as well. I'd like to read it to you quickly. So historically underserved and underrepresented students will have access to and inclusion in all learning activities in school. BUSD will advance equity practices by ensuring that the voices of our students are represented. They feel seen and their cultures and stories are valued, with a particular focus on students who are Black, socioeconomically disadvantaged, English learners, Latinx, LGBTQ, and students in special education. And you might say, at the public's watching, well, how did you come up with that goal? Dr. Beatson leads a very robust process with a group called the LCAP, but she also has broad stakeholder outreach and the development of the goals based on the data that we have within our system to put these together. And then this goal will be in the larger LCAP strategic plan that will be brought to the board for ultimate approval. I think that's in May, I believe. So I just wanted to point that out to you, that we have things in place and we continue to do this important, big, and complex work. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to our facilitator, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you. I appreciate the reminder and the overview of the work you've done. And so I wanted, before jumping into things, I want to just give the opportunity for any of the governance team to ask any questions or comments about the work you've done already before we jump into our work today. All right, good. All right. So before we jump in, just a few logistics. One, this is your Saturday. So I want to say first to sit back and relax. And I say that very, very openly and candidly as we are in still a public meeting. Today is a day that represents not a regular board meeting. This is not board business where you'll take action. This is simply a study session. And so the community understands what that means is this is your sacred time to do professional learning together. That's what this represents today. So I say sit back and relax because this is an opportunity to ask questions and have real deep discussion that normally doesn't happen at a board meeting. And so I always am honored to provide this space for board members, especially during this time. I have had the distinct pleasure of working with board members who frankly, just to say, have been beat up the last year. And I want to acknowledge that. I don't even know if that's the right word to use, but there have been some tremendous experiences for obviously our students. I want to call them out first, right? It's always about them. It's not about us as adults. But I want to acknowledge that because us adults run the system, that our adults have also been harmed by these two pandemics, I call it, right? It's like COVID and it's racism. And they both came to a head right around the same time, which is interesting. And I think that made things very tough. So I want to acknowledge that because today is really an opportunity to, take a step towards healing together. Governance teams mean that, there's 5 of us and we come together with our superintendent to really lead the district based on our roles as board members. And sometimes we don't have an opportunity just to learn together and talk. And so this is what this is designed for today. So I want to say that because often we start our work and we go into business mode. So today is more about learning. Very important for us to have a chance to learn. So this is your study session. Jump in at any time, ask questions. And for the logistical space, I want to just acknowledge your cabinet, Dr. Young, who's here today as well. Good to see you, Kush. It's great to hang out again with you today. Also, I think Tim was somewhere around. There you are, Tim. Good to see you as well. And also, Leslie, great to see you. Thank you, Michael, for allowing this to work for us today. And also, again, Georgina, for herding the cats, as I call it, keeping it together. But I do also want to say today is really more focused on the governance team. So I want to respectfully acknowledge the staff, but also respectfully say that today I'll really more be focused on the board with our work. And so while you're participants, you won't be active participants, but you definitely, you being here is really critical. For you to be able to engage in the work that you're going to do with your board, because what the board often is doing is giving directive to superintendent, which means that superintendent and designees then get to implement the work, right? So it's important you're here, and there may be a moment every once in a while that you may need to clarify, but today is really more about governance. So I want to just acknowledge that and also know that I'm not ignoring you, but it's really going to be focused on the governance team and the superintendent who also is part of the team. So hopefully that sounds okay. So what I want to do is you all got an opportunity to take a look at your packet. I know you're an amazing board that always does your homework, so not worried about that. But today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the documents that I shared. And Sherry, as you mentioned earlier, some of them are very similar to what we've shared with your Solano network. But today is really more about centering on your team. So we're going to look at those documents, and we're actually going to go back to them in future study sessions. I know we haven't set all of our dates, but we still have multiple study sessions to follow up. Dr. Young, I remember we have 3 more potentially for going into next year that we may talk about and following up. We're still planning how you all want to engage in your work, but know that today there'll be a little non-closure because we're not going to get everything done, but it's not designed for that. What I want to do is make sure you have a chance to really hit the key things that are critical for board members to consider when engaging in equity-focused work. So in your handouts, you should have your water system change article. Also, there was a board assessment that as well that has 8 characteristics of effective governance teams. Those are the 2 documents I'm going to really focus on today. The other kind of auxiliary documents support those, and we will utilize those for you to reference kind of on your own to go deeper. But those are the two documents I want to make sure you have handy. And then also there was a PowerPoint slide that I shared, which you can try to follow along if you like. However, what I'll do is share it on the screen so that you can kind of get the gist of where we're going to go today. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other. But again, this is your study session. Sit back, relax, have your Starbucks. Hopefully, Diane, yours arrived. And we, she's like, not yet. And then we'll also take a couple of breaks. So that was the other thing, is make sure that you let me know, like, hey, my brain is frying. This feels like drinking water from a fire hose. I need to pause. So we'll try to take at least like 2 bio breaks if possible. So just if I get carried away, just jump in and let me know. Okay. All right. So as we begin this work together, the way I like to couch this is we're going to look at effective governance with an equity lens. So what I'll talk about today is we'll talk about governance itself, but we're going to talk about it in a way where we have to think about how do we make sure there's structures in place to advance our equity work. And so often we'll talk about this go slow to go fast process, because with governance and equity work, often we get very anxious to kind of move the work. I know many of you have seen community members who are amazing, have great perspectives, lots of different versions of them. And sometimes they want to make the work go faster, and then some may actually make the work want to go a little slower or not at all. So we're going to figure out today, like, how do we kind of push that to the side for a moment and just think about where are we in our journey, right? Like, where are we as a governance team? And then how do we think about how we're going to advance our work, looking at what Dr. Young shared earlier. The reason why you see this image on the screen is very important, I think, to ground ourselves in like why we're here. And when I think about all the craziness that's been going on around us, and the word crazy may not even be the best way to describe. I think I've said unreal many a times, right? Unreal, unprecedented. As a governance team, it's been very hard for all governance teams across the nation have really had a hard time. And one of the things that I'd like to help you think about is kind of pushing some of those, I call them distractions and just messiness, the storms of this work, pushing them aside and thinking about, wow, what excitement we have as educators to be able to think about what Frederick Douglass reminded us of, right? Is that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I'll add women and people. It's easier to build strong children. And when I think about what Dr. Young shared with the characteristics of your graduate from Benicia Unified, think about what that word strong means, right? And when you think about having a strong graduate that goes into society and can do all the things on that list, be an entrepreneur, right? Be a great citizen, have the characteristics of what we want. That's our future, is what you shared in the portrait of a graduate. And so we have to build that at early ages. That doesn't happen once they leave our system. And so I think if you look about how important this work is now, and thinking about with our community, how to really establish what we call strong, meaning someone who understands differences, right? Someone who knows how to respond to differences, someone who can really navigate this world of differences, because that's all this is. That's what we need in our children, because we see right now there's a lot of brokenness with us adults. I think we all would agree. A lot of brokenness, a lot of confusion, and we want to really mend that. But it's hard to do that after the fact. So I'm excited. The one profession on the planet are educators who, besides the family, who is a first teacher, right? We always want to make sure we honor the family. That is the first teacher. Okay. But we know that kids spend a lot of time with us. And so we have, I think, a moral obligation to do whatever we can to support the families and how they raise their children, but also the expertise we have as educators, what we can do to really support that strength of a kid going into the world as an adult. And so I just want to make that connection to why this work is so important as policymakers when we talk about impacting something like a school district where we impact thousands of children. So as we jump into the work, you always remember from our equity network that we talked about the 4 agreements. So I want to just remind us of those and make sure that we're still all good with these. I think it's very important even that our community see that we have some agreements on how we engage in this work, and invite the community to do the same. That when we talk about moving from safe space, like we have to even have safety to do this work. And I think we all would agree that if people don't feel safe, if they feel attacked, if they feel like they are not able to engage in this work with us, if they feel they're not adequate enough, they feel like they may be retaliated against or harmed, like those are all things that are unsafe. And we want everyone in our community in Benicia to be able to have safe space for everybody. So that means that we have to somehow work to cultivating that even within and practicing that within, so that we also can demonstrate what we expect from others. And safety is important. I think that's really important. But one of the things that Dr. Tyrone Howard from UCLA mentions is that we have to move from that safety into a space of brave space, which means that now we have the courage to be able to go deeper into this work. And that what may be a little more uncomfortable. And so the work of Glenn Singleton, who's been around, I don't know, almost 30 years now, I'd say, in education, maybe longer, but has been doing work around courageous conversations about race. And I often use this analogy or his perspective of the 4 agreements, which comes from his work, because he talks a lot about race. And as we talk about equity, like race is a component, but it's not equity, right? Equity has a lot of different things that we talk about. But I love from his work, the 4 agreements, because he has a context of race, which is a super uncomfortable conversation. I think we've all been conditioned not to really talk about it openly, because it's probably one of the most uncomfortable things that all of us have experienced in terms of conversation. So what I love about his 4 agreements, again, is these really help establish some safe space for us to be able to engage together. Because ultimately it's going to be uncomfortable. And so we have to wrestle with safety and discomfort. They're really 2 different things, but safety is really, really important. So when we talk about the 4 agreements, stay engaged is what we want to ask us as a team to do, right? Especially when it's uncomfortable. Lean into the work, right? Think about what this means when we have like public comment and we have engagement with community members. Sometimes it's hard to stay engaged because one is like, okay, our role in like a regular board meeting is not necessarily to respond, right? I think sometimes community members don't always understand like that's not necessarily the space to engage. It's not a community forum, it's a board meeting, right? But how do we stay engaged even in the structures of this work? And then how do we stay engaged when it's like uncomfortable? Right? Or we're on Zoom, right? Like that's a whole nother piece. You've all been on Zoom all year. How do you engage in this work when we're like virtually not even near each other? But the commitment has to be stay engaged and be okay with the discomfort that comes with this work. And then that's what the second one is that like we all have to agree to lean into this and be okay with discomfort, recognizing that that's the way we're going to grow within our school district, within our community. And this is a hard agreement because sometimes I think we've been in spaces where as adults, in comparison to our children, like we've had the kind of the privilege to be comfortable, right? We've had that for so long as educators, like we have power over our kids and even our families. So sometimes like when it's uncomfortable, like it's often easy to disengage. And so with this work, you have to like really be conscious, like when there's some discomfort that comes up, when we have to have conversations about changing policies that may be impactful, that everyone doesn't agree on, but we know it's best for all kids, that has to be a space we be okay with that so we can grow. And so we'll practice some of that today just in having our own experiences we're going to share, which goes to 3, speaking your truth. What does this mean as a governance team? Well, we're a public, entity, right? We're elected officials. So everything we do is in public. So speaking our truth is not always as easy as people think. And so I want to acknowledge that for you as a governance team, that speaking your truth, each of you individually as a team all have a perspective, right? Which is valuable and important. It's the reason why people elected you to be in this space, because your truth, your perspective is so valuable. And so as you come together as a governance team, as you know, once we hit that gavel and we open the meeting up, we're now one group and we have a truth, right, that we speak as a team. And that's the difficulty of this work, is because all of us have great, amazing experiences, but how do we come together and be truthful with who we are as a team? And that's the harder part of this work. And the reality is this, that our truth as a team may differ from someone who's in the community. It may differ from some of our partners in the community. And that's okay. It may differ when we talk about equity work. So being okay with engaging with people speaking their truth is something we'll have to continue to work at. I always call it a journey, because everyone's truth may be different. And we have to learn to celebrate differences versus thinking that they're bad for us to have different truths. That's okay. We just have to work through them on behalf of what we said we were here to serve, which is children. Now, the last one, which is interesting, is this 4th one of saying expect and accept non-closure. So one of the things that we will all struggle with, and the community I think will struggle with, is that this is not an overnight process of trying to close equity gaps in Benicia Unified School District. As Dr. Young shared on the screen, and Dr. Beeson has shared over and over, like why this LCAP goal exists, equity goal. Why are we even doing this work? Well, we have specific kids you called out, which I admire and want to acknowledge that every district doesn't always call out the specific kids who are showing up as not being served as well in the system. So you called out your African-American kids, you called out your LGBTQ kids, your Latino kids, and you keep going down the list, right, of all the kids who may have some experience as maybe not as positive based on the data. And so calling that out requires us to recognize it's going to take some time. So it's a journey. And so that's why I always say you got to expect a little non-closure. And when you close the meetings and adjourn, you have to remember you're going to come back to those things, right? You don't have to necessarily solve it all overnight, because it's a journey. It's hundreds of years worth of inequities that you've decided to try to tackle. And so this is important as a governance team, because sometimes even with trying to make a decision, you may all have your moments where you have to vote on something, right? And I think every board has been challenged with this year, is how do we vote on something and all 5 of us agree, right? Like we always want to have like this consensus. But the reality is sometimes that's not the case, and that's all right. That's why your individual board member, you vote however you want. However, with equity work, it's important that we really have that united vision. And so this is where I often tell board members is that when you're not sure how you want to move forward on something, it's okay to table things and come back to them. I think sometimes there's the pressure of making a decision because our community wants us to make the decision. But with board business, you're going to have to accept and expect some non-closure. And that means sometimes we'll have to pause, get more information. We may say, Dr. Young, Dr. Beeson, we need some more information so that we can make a sound decision based on our vision for what equity is. And that's hard because this is passionate work, right? I know you all are passionate about this. And one of the things we say to folks is that equity leadership is not driven by passion. It has to be there, of course, right? Our core values. And it's not driven by emotions. It's driven by data. It's driven by our core values, and it's driven by strategy. And so that requires a little bit extra time. So that accepting non-closure is going to be important on your journey. Okay. Now I spent some time on this, and I won't spend too much time in future study sessions doing this because you've seen these, but I want to just today make a connection to the 4 agreements as a governance team, right? As a governance team, because these are going to be really important as you continue to lean in on your work. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be messy, right? And you got to recognize that's part of interrupting a system. And you've made that commitment to do that because you have equity gaps. So it's going to happen. So these agreements are really great to stick together in terms of when you feel the messiness, go back to your agreements. Okay, we knew this was going to happen. We know it's going to be uncomfortable, but now we're going to grow together. Questions, thoughts, what's resonating with you? You've all seen these before, but I gave you a different twist to them today and connecting to governance versus individuals. So any questions or thoughts you might have about the 4 agreements and connecting to the work you're doing?
I had a quick comment to make, and love to hear from others if they have anything to say. When you're talking about that discomfort thing, I was thinking about that we're learning, and then as teachers, I think we talk about cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance, whether it is you're learning a new idea, you're learning your piano scales, which I'm still working on after all these years. And you're in this space where it's just sort of, inbound, but that's where the growth takes place. You can't live permanently in cognitive dissonance, but it is that, I don't know, that was my connection from the discomfort to that learning place and changing your mindset, which you'll talk about later. And then one other quick point, I'm so glad that you reminded us that all of this work, all of these conversations and these adult interactions are all designed to affect what that experience is for our students whom we serve in the classroom. That's the only reason we're doing this. So thank you for that really important reminder.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well said. Anyone else from the team want to jump in? Any questions or comments about the 4 agreements? All right. So they're resonating with us. The connections are there. All right, good. So I'm going to, as a facilitator, kind of push you for all 4 of these. But in it, what I call a safe way. It's very important for me as a facilitator that there's safety in this work. But of course, there's a level of discomfort that we know is going to happen. So let's just kind of center our work for a moment as a governance team. And the way I want to do this is to help you just kind of like back up for a minute and think about kind of the why, the how, and the what to the work you're doing. Okay, sometimes that's a really good way to think about it, especially again, when it's going to get messy. When I say center the work, I often will say recenter the work, is sometimes we just need to pause and just go back to why are we doing this, right? And then how are we doing this and the what? And so as a governance team, I like to connect it to Simon Sinek's work and his golden circle. But the why of the work, what we're going to unpack today is one, having an equity statement. Like, what does it mean, right? Like, why are we here? What's our vision around equity? So it's going to tie directly to an equity statement is what we call it, or your definition. Your core values, right? Like what you believe, your shared beliefs. And so we're going to talk about that because your why of the work is going to be so important because it's the core of everything you do. So when we forget our why, then that's often where we get like kind of sidetracked. I call it, we get distracted. And I'm sure you all can agree, there's been some distractions this year, just a few, right? Just a few. And so it's often important to go back to your why. The how of the work as a governance team, this is important for us too, is to think about what are our norms, how we operate, what are our protocols? What do we do? How do we make decisions? What's our role in the work? Okay, and that's going to be really important. So that thing called your governance handbook, that thing you look at like every week. I know you review them all the time, right? Well, I know. Don't worry about it. Most governance teams have the same response, right? It's like, oh yeah, that thing, where is that? Let me dust that off. And you usually revise it like once a year, right? And that's great. But one of the things that's important with this work is you probably have to go back to your handbook a few times. And here's why. Is that this work, it's not the same work you normally do. So it becomes very different and it challenges your norms. It challenges how you operate together. It even challenges your roles because, again, when I say the word passion, what does that do? Well, someone may come to you as a board member and say, hey, and this could be just a community member, you're doing equity work and we need to do X, Y, and Z at this school. And so there's a problem here. I need you to come and take a look. And so you as a board member go, oh, okay, let me go take a look. Let me go visit the school. And I go, time out. Don't forget our roles in this work, right? Because you might be passionate about whatever that board or that community member asked you, but we got to go back to what are our roles? Is that the role of the superintendent to address that issue? Or is that your role, right? And that's important to pause and think about it because equity work is a little different, right? It's more of a passionate space, right? And so often we kind of forget that. And so go back to our protocols, right? What do we agree to do? What are our norms? And even working with each other. So those are important with equity work because sometimes we'll forget and it's sitting right in your handbook. So if you ever forget, that's something to consider. And if you're to a place where you're like, maybe we need to revise our norms and our protocols, then that's also something we do when you do your revision of your handbook, because this work is going to challenge all of those, even down to like public comment, down to how you address and respond. All of those things that show up in your handbook, these are things you're going to have to reconsider with your equity work. Okay. And remember, you're creating a culture for a board. So you all may be on right now. Think about 10 years from now, what culture do you leave? 20 years from now, what culture do you leave around doing governance with an equity lens? And creating norms to do that is very important. Okay. And that's why the handbooks are important too, because those usually are those written documents that you leave kind of the breadcrumbs for someone who comes along, right, later on. Now, the what of the work, the outcomes, the results. What is it you're all going to do, right? What does this look like from a board member's perspective? Well, we know your role is policy, right? So that's where we're going to talk policy. And having an equity policy is very important to drive your governance and policy work. So we're actually going to talk about how to develop a policy that's going to really be kind of your lens for how you make decisions because you are policymakers. That is your role. We'll talk about priorities. Very important that we prioritize the work. Because again, you're going to be pulled 50 different directions because equity work is very robust. And so what we want to do is make sure that you can do the work. So we talk about prioritizing, really narrowing your focus so you can be really good at the things that you want to do and not get pulled 50 directions. And so priorities for boards is really important. And we'll talk about what that means because everything is important, right? You serve all kids, even having area trustees, like you still serve the school district, right? And so what's important is you recognize what are going to be those things you spend the most time on so that you don't have board meetings that last till 2 a.m. like my friends I was with yesterday who will remain nameless, who I teased 2 nights ago. And I was with him yesterday. I'm like, you all are still awake, right? So the reality is this, that sometimes prioritizing the work will also show up in your agendas, right? Like, what are those things that are most critical you're going to spend time on? And then lastly is an equity impact plan, which is something that really aligns with what Dr. Beatson kind of leads with the LCAP process. So your LCAP is how many pages? Do you know how many pages it is now? I know Leslie knows, but this is a trivia question. How many pages is your LCAP? Just take a look. Look, she's got the visual there. How many pages is that? I know it used to be like 400, right? And now it's like dwindled down. So you remember when LCAP first came out, it was a huge document, and it's starting to narrow down to the things that are really most critical, right? And based on you being a fiscally sound board that has to oversee based on resource allocation, it shows up in your LCAP. Well, guess what? Your LCAP is a lot. There's a lot that's in there, but your prioritized equity work will actually have to have a game plan. How are you going to serve those groups that Dr. Young pulled out in terms of how are you going to serve African-American kids, right? What does that plan look like? How are you going to do your professional development, right? That has to be planned because the board actually impacts that work. So having an impact plan is what we talk about, and it ties directly to your policy as well. Okay, so you kind of see, like, for governance, like when you talk about recentering, like, what is the work we're going to do? This is the core of that work. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through all of these now. All right. So let's just kind of talk a little bit about the why and the whole, like, what does equity mean? And actually what I want to do before we even go into this slide, I want to ask you all, Dr. Young shared his, well, let me back up. Dr. Young, I'm going to stop sharing. Can you reshare your screen with the vision statement? It had like all the boxes and had the vision at the top with your characteristics of a graduate, your portrait of a graduate. Or thanks, Leslie, appreciate it. All right, so that vision statement at the top, once you take a look, and I'm going to just pick on someone so we can kind of practice equity of voice. Cece, can I pick on you first? You're like, no. Can you do us a huge favor and just read the vision statement for us out loud?
Vision, BUSD, where all students achieve at their highest potential in an engaging, inspiring, and challenging learning environment.
Awesome. Thank you. As you heard Cece read that, and as you look at it again on the screen, I'm just staying at the top for a moment. When you think about the vision, do you think that that is a commonly held vision across your entire district? So this is kind of an open discussion. Is this a commonly held vision across your district?
How would we know? How would we know if it was across the entire district? I don't have interaction with everybody throughout the district. I mean, I get it being the overarching view.
Yep.
But to say, do we know it's throughout the entire, I wouldn't know how I would know. I don't have interactions with enough people to really make that, you know, feeling one way or the other.
Great point. Yeah. We're going to unpack that one.
Yeah. And
I'm not sure.
I agree with Marcus. Like, how would you know? But if I were to look at the data and what the data shows in terms of how students are achieving, I would have to say no. You know, I think that we have it in writing, which is great. And I do believe that people believe it, you know, folks who are working in the education system, but the reality is that all of our kids are not successful at all. And if we were to really pay attention to that, then we would do things differently to make sure that that statement was actually true. So,
okay.
Just my
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, jump in, Diane.
Well, you know, I think Gethsemane touched on one thing. It's written, and I know when we get things from all the schools, you'll find it somewhere written in their paperwork, their flyers that go out. But you know, I think it's kind of when we do trainings in schools, and I know I was on the board the very beginning when this happened, and a lot of training occurred, but I think it's like a lot of conversations that we've had in the past through AXA. You know, you do an initial training, but then the players change.
Yep.
And as the players change, I mean, one of the
one of the balancing acts, I know you and Gethsemane had these experiences because you all did training just like I did at school sites. If you don't keep doing the foundational training to bring everybody on board so that everyone can engage in a conversation, you just can't keep extending. You've got to keep, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well
so
said.
I'm not sure that always happens because we're always getting so much to do. And I think that's the fine dance in education that we have to keep up with. I mean, we're always getting something new thrown at us.
Yeah.
And yet you can't forget the base training, because if you don't give people the foundation in order to have that conversation, to explain what that means, and to be able to connect the ties. I mean, I'm not so sure that there's a belief or a practice there with everyone, and which is where I think we want to go.
Yeah.
Because then you would be questioning, like Gethsemane and CC, or even Mark referred to. It's like, yeah, but how do we really know it? Because you wouldn't be pushing back on some of those strategies that we're trying to make sure everybody has to make all children become successful. Yeah. So, I mean, that's sometimes where my head goes. So I don't know.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I think the historical context I appreciate, because you remember when this was developed. And so, and I appreciate you sharing, it's written, right? And but it may not be reviewed often. And I also heard Dr. Moss say that it's the data doesn't reflect it, right? Like I think we all agree, like most educators, like, yeah, like we believe this, but it doesn't necessarily reflect on paper, right? It doesn't reflect in actions at times. And so there's a little bit of a gap, but this is, yeah. So I appreciate that. Anyone else want to jump in?
I had a quick thought on this too, that we, as part of the LCAP strategic plan process, we do a survey to the public. And so we put together, I think, I don't know, it's the first time we did this. Leslie was very clever. We put together a survey to get parent response on the vision statement and the beliefs. And so there was definitely in that data for the parents who were kind enough to respond to it, areas that we needed to grow. And I would also like to say that there were comments in there where people were saying we did have an environment that's engaging, inspiring, and challenging. So there was some good evidence in there, but kind of on both ends, right? Like you're getting after it, but there's room to grow.
Yeah.
And then as superintendent, and back to Mark's point, that's a great point, right? And Gethsemane too, unless you have the wherewithal to walk through classrooms all the time, it's hard to know this. So another data point I would say as a superintendent, being able to walk in and out of classrooms a lot, seeing examples of engaging, inspiring, and challenging. I do see a lot of examples of that. Doesn't mean we don't have room for growth, because all systems do.
Yeah. And you know what, I appreciate you calling out, like measuring it. And I think, Mark, you said, like, how do we actually know, right? And I think there's multiple ways to measure, like, is this commonly a held belief and kind of vision across the district? And you mentioned parent surveys, which I think is very important. Like, do parents believe it? But who do we really need to hear from, right? It's like, we say, like, we want them to achieve at their highest potential. Like, do kids believe this? And I think that's important. Do they believe that, one, they can reach their highest potential, which is that whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That's the top of the pyramid. But then, like, that engaging, like, how do we measure it's engaging? Like, to who? And this is important when we talk about equity work, because, like, as you unpack this very vision, this is where we have to unpack, is it engaging for all students, right? Is it inspiring for all students? Is it challenging for all students? Which challenging kind of speaks to, like, high expectations, right? And rigor. So now when you unpack that, it becomes even more complex, right? Because I think what you said, Dr. Young, is you can observe and see it, which is one way to collect data, right? We can do a survey. And then I think what Dr. Moss was alluding to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like the data around achievement in itself, right? Like, we're seeing the data, like test scores and grades and you name it. And so when you add all that together and we think about, okay, if our vision is that all students achieve at their highest potential, and there may be a gap here and there. And what I love for you is you called out, like, the how of the work, and you called out the experiences that are needed versus just all kids achieve basically graduate, career, high school, career, college ready, the kind of very normal nuance we use in schools, which is important, right? We want all our kids to leave our system, graduate, be college and career ready. But what we also have to recognize is there's a process to get there. And sometimes that data, that hard data that Dr. Moss talked about, is not necessarily reflecting what actually kids experience. And so when we talk about equity, right, the actual definition of equity, I'm curious if you actually see your vision statement as your definition of equity. I was curious. Do you feel like this is calling out equity? Anybody? Do you feel like this is your definition of equity? No right or wrong answer, by the way.
Equity, if you're asking if it's my definition, I don't know. But when you use the word all students achieve their highest potential, that's not saying all students are going to score in the 90th percentile or whatever. The highest potential is whatever the highest potential is for that kid in an engaging, inspiring, and challenging learning environment. I'm not saying it's my definition of equity, but I could see where someone, pardon me, where someone would say it is, because you're saying all students. You're not saying, you're trying to reach everybody.
Yeah. I love it. I appreciate that, because you said like every kid might not get a 90% on the standardized test, right?
Right.
But they have other forms and metrics of success which may show up. That do we value those metrics or not? Like that's going to be the piece about what does highest potential even mean. Diane, you had a thought?
Well, just again, I'm going to kind of go back, and so Charles, if you feel like I'm misconstruing, please jump in. But when we had this conversation, yes, for me that was part of that statement, because we talked about all kids, and I remember we had a real robust conversation about that. We needed to keep in mind that it's not the same for every child. We had, and that was an important piece to that. In fact, I was kind of chuckling a little bit when you did the our SCOE training, because we had such a great discussion about your visuals and how they changed from. And Charles, I don't know if you remember, but I actually shared that visual at one point when we were having that conversation. How about, the differences with what kids need and how they may need it delivered in a different way. So when that conversation and all was put in there, that was our conversation. Is that meant we needed to look at what all kids needed, and it may not be what I need, and it may not be what you need, but it might be what Mark needs. Right. So therefore, it was important. So so at that time, yes, that was the at least in my mind, with the conversation I was having, that was my discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, Charles, if you can do me a favor, and I'm sorry, Leslie, if you can do me a favor and stop sharing, I'll actually put that image up that I think Diane is referring to, because I think it's a good connection.
I still love that video.
The video
No,
version.
not the video, the visual.
Is it the kids on the boxes?
Yes.
All right, there we go. Uh-oh. Come on. That one.
Yeah. That one.
Okay.
Gethsemane, I think you had a point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think for me, just kind of listening to what everybody, like everybody's feedback and comments, when I think about that particular statement, I just kind of like along what Diane was saying, I feel like if it is, equity, because we're talking about all, then that means that we as educators would have to change or adapt some of our practices so that we can make, reach all. Yes. I feel like what happens in education is that we have these techniques and things that we're supposed to incorporate so that we can, facilitate the learning environment. But I don't think that, I think sometimes where we may fall short is that we don't truly understand all those levels of engagement that it does really require if it's going to be all kids, because everybody does not learn and take in information the same. So that's the part where it's tricky. Like our intentions might be well-intended, but what's happening on the other end of that is that it's just not, somehow it doesn't trickle down the way it needs to for students to be able to grasp whatever it is that they're expected of them. So it's a really tricky situation.
Bless you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, well said. It is complex. And I think that's why we're here today, to unpack that, right? Because there's so many different ways to see it. And we're going to go to like the history again, because, we've talked about that, but I want to make sure that we as a team kind of go back to like how we even got to this place. I think that complexity, we have to recognize from a policy level where that actually plays a role in how we even measure success, which is interesting considering the state mandates, right? And all the different ways we measure student success. It's going to be interesting to see. Other thoughts? I want to come in. Yeah, jump in.
One quick statement back to that, and I don't want to start wordsmithing, but the enormity of writing those things as a group process with an entire town.
It's a lot.
Quite a challenge. Yeah. That being said, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be open to modifying things. One quick point about that statement. This might sound a little pedantic, but when you think about a mission and a vision statement, a mission statement, this is our purpose and our function. And a vision statement is your desired future state. And when I look at that, for me, it can actually function as both, right? Yeah. And this is what we should be and what we inspire to be. We don't need to do this now, but one of the things as you guys were looking at that, and a great question, does this reflect, the thoughts about equity? And Diane, appreciated your comments. I think, Nicole, as we go through this, we're going to talk about developing our, some belief statements around what is equity, or what do we believe around it specifically, that possibly don't have to do this, but maybe just adding the word equitable in that vision statement, that it's, equitable, engaging, et cetera. Just a thought. We can come back to it, but I just wanted to share.
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of the process, so it's funny you bring that up, Dr. Young, because that image on the right, the whole elephant blind man poem that I often make connections to, that is the process that you will have to continuously go through to unpack what is that elephant, AKA equity, right? Because everyone has a different perspective, and even the simple words that you use will actually make a difference on how you develop what I call a common vision and a common lens for how you govern in Benicia Unified School District. So that process definitely includes wordsmithing, right? Having discussions, not just with this team, but even after creating like an equity statement as a board, right? You have a lot of hearing of other people's perspectives, right? That will really help you now determine, again, what does engaging mean? If that was a word that's in your statement, right? It's in your vision, but what does that mean? And I'm going to go back to what Mark said. This is the biggest question out of all it. How do we actually know? How do we know? That's going to be the role of the board, is to ask questions, not only of your superintendent, right, but also of the staff. And of course, in your moments where you get to do community forums and engage with your community members, how do we know that our vision is actually taking root? And that's going to be the $1 million question. So thank you, Mark, for bringing that up, because I think that's going to always be, it's kind of what I asked you on purpose, because I knew that the answer is going to be very messy, but this is the process, right? Is that we as a governance team have to have a common vision for what equity is, and it's going to take time. There are some districts who have already done the 3 steps that I recommend of boards, is have an equity statement. What's your vision, your why of this work? Have an actual equity policy, and then have a plan. And so even after having a statement, there's still work to be done, because remember, what we want to do is find out, is that what equity means to those that we're serving? We could have a robust kind of vision and ambitious about what we want to do, but is it actually based on what our kids need? So my example often used is this elephant piece. We talk about the elephant and the blind man. And in this particular poem, as they're arguing about what the elephant is, remember that the elephant is not a monolithic thing, right? Like, it's kind of like our kids. If our kids kind of represented that elephant, and you have a kid who has the same demographic kind of profile, right? All kids who might identify just like an ethnic category, they may not all have the same needs. And so we can't assume that, right? And so I often would use my kids as an example, right? Like, there was a point where there were 2 of our children in your school district, right? And what's interesting is that those two kids had very different needs, but they had the same profile, the same mom and dad, right? They both identify as African-American kids, and one's a male, one's a female. And so they have different needs. They're different learning styles, different personalities. And so what we don't want to do is assume that kids all are the same. And that's, I think, where that word all is important, right? Because all means every kid, but then when we start unpacking who kids are individually, that's where you start to see it becomes very complex. And to answer Mark's question, how do we know? That's when we have to be really, really clear about when we say this is success for our children, it's not just about what we see, it's about what they see. So often what I use this analogy that I just stole from I do superintendent searches because I just, have lots of time on my hands. And there was a particular response from a candidate that I've kind of stolen and borrowed this response around like looking at kids through like data, right? And how do you actually measure that equity is happening for kids? And so the analogy was like a baseball card analogy where you have like, think about every single one of your kids in Benicia has its own kind of like trading card, right? And when you look at the image of the kid on the front of the card, you see their beautiful face, you see their beautiful names, and then you flip it over and what do you see? You see their stats, right? Their data. And what do we typically look at with kids when we look at data? We look at test scores, grades, attendance, behavior, graduate, whatever, right? And what do we forget? The other stats that are even more important is their story, right? What are they interested in? What is their cultural identity? Okay, what is their experiences that really have been positive that work well for them, right? What have been their like success stories, like a kid who may have been the leading role in like a play, right? Like, do we have that as the stats, or do we just have the same academic metrics that actually don't drive and inspire every kid, right? And I often use my own self as an example. I was a really good basketball player. I got a scholarship to go to college, and I feel like looking back, had my teachers and administrators and everyone who was an adult really got to know me. For one, I identify as an African-American kid where I was one of the few, very similar kind of district like a Benicia, right? Where you may have like one of a few kids in a class. I had that experience. And although I wanted it to be relevant, I think it would have been great to see myself in the images in the books. If some of the lessons were related to like my cultural identity based on ethnicity, I think that would have been great. Even as a female, like maybe like connecting it to, female scientists and mathematicians, right? And chemists, folks who could relate to me. I just wish that they would have recognized I was a really good basketball player and that motivated me, right? And guess what? Like my math teacher who happened to be my basketball coach, two of them, when I learned geometry, like could they have totally like connected that to like basketball? Absolutely. The angles on the court, right? Like all of that, which would have been so instrumental in college. Like I struggled my first year because of simply not understanding like the bigger context of positionality on the court, right? And when you pass the ball, what's the best angle? All of those things. Math teacher could have taught that, right? But my point is, if without knowing my story and how my brain worked, there were some things that were missed. And here's what's so cool about this concept of knowing who kids are and connecting to their stories actually improves attendance, achievement, behavior by just connecting to who they are and making it relevant. So why am I bringing this up? As governance teams, you operate up here. And without understanding those kind of that piece of what it should look like for a kid and that whole portrait of the graduate, without seeing that, then we won't ask the right questions when it's time to say, okay, you showed me the data, Dr. Beatson, right? You showed me the data, right? Which she needs to show you, right? And that's the information that shows you like we're being successful because these metrics, they are important, right? There's funding associated with how well kids do in your schools, right? There's a whole lot that goes with compliance and making sure kids are in school. So I get that data is important, but what are those questions you ask in collaboration with your staff to say, hey, but what's behind this data? Why are these experiences the way they are? Kids are doing really well. The kid in the blue shirt, right in that picture. What is their story? They might be doing really well on those tests. They might have straight A's. They might be your valedictorians. but are they emotionally being and socially, emotionally being supported? Are they healthy? Or I hate bringing up like this triggers, but I tell you, you've experienced suicide in your school district. And it hurts me because you experienced a situation where I knew a child who you lost and who actually used to be in class with my son. And you know, one thing I thought about, and lots of districts experienced this trauma, by the way, this year. I want to acknowledge it. One of the things that's really hard is that we in education don't always have the tools to know how do we address the social emotional piece, which absolutely connects to academic achievement. Right? There are kids who are not faring well now, as you all know. Distance learning kind of sucks for some kids, right? Some kids are doing great, some kids are not. How do you ask those questions about, is equity happening for our children? And it's not just going to be test scores anymore. And that's what I think is going to be the shift in, again, answering Mark's question is, how do we know? Right? And that as a board, what are the questions you're going to ask? So I'm going to give you some of those examples, but I want you, again, I'm bringing this up because the question is this a commonly held belief in your district? So I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to refresh my screen because I actually, let's see if it'll refresh.
Nicole, can I just make a comment?
Yeah, jump right in.
No, what you were saying really kind of resonates with me because I think that, as you know, of course, I'm an educator. And so what I found is that the whole idea about being able to build relationships, getting to know the kids, that is vitally important. And one of the things that I continue to do as an educator, because I want kids to know that I see them. But I think that what happens in our system for the adults is that we don't always do those practices either. So
right.
Staff meetings and things like that, but it's not ever, it's not, we don't even take the time to get to know each other. That way. So it's kind of like we end up perpetuating those same practices when it goes into the school sites and the classrooms.
Absolutely.
Like that. At least that's been my experience. I mean, I personally ask myself when I've gone to meetings, like, I don't even know if I want to be in this space because I don't even feel like I'm like invisible. So like,
right. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that because I think that's part of why I'm kind of asking you all, like, what is the common vision, right? And we got to engage people in this conversation, right? I would like to say this is that non-closure piece. Like, you don't have the final answer, but it starts with you as a governance team because you set policy and you set vision, right? And so then when we have folks engage and we're open to hearing those dialogues, right? Because I think that's important, is to be okay with everybody's going to see this a little different. And that's okay, right? Just like the elephant blind men, like they're all touching on the elephant. They got their own perspectives, right? And they're calling it out like the way they see it. Like the tail is not a tail. It's a rope to the gentleman in the back. It's a rope. The ear is a fan. And they're all right. They're all right. But then they're all wrong in terms of not having a common understanding, even though they have different perspectives. And so I want to call that out as this is going to be part of your process. Now, here's what I want to do is I want to ask each of you, as you look at your vision statement, I'm just going to give you kind of my, professional kind of perspective. I think your vision statement actually calls out equity. I'm just going to be frank with you. It calls it out. But it's going to require you, again, to figure out how to measure, is this happening, right? And that's a deeper conversation. But I want to ask you from an individual standpoint, each of you have your own perspective here. I'm going to just ask each of you for a moment. When you think about the word equity, and actually I'm going to pause. Well, I'm going to give you the question. I'm going to pause and ask you to respond after I show you a little video. So the question is this: individually, as you think of what equity means to you, so each of you, Gethsemane, Cece, like each of you individually, what one word comes to mind that you could say describes equity to you? One word. Okay, so I want you to think about that one word, and I don't want you to answer yet, because I'm going to share another couple of perspectives, and then I'm going to ask you to share with me out loud. And then we're going to kind of talk about what Dr. Young said is maybe crafting our statement that includes our perspective and more context of equity that you potentially could create as an equity statement. Okay, so I want you to think about what that one word is, but don't share it yet, because I'm going to give you a couple things to help think through this process. Okay, so one is I'm going to share a sample definition, which you may have seen. I think you all have seen this one. So you remember the National Equity Project. So they're out of Oakland, and this is a definition they share. And just notice what you see being called out, which is very similar to your vision statement. Just take a look at that. Okay, notice what they're calling out. Again, that full potential academically and socially. So they're calling out kind of the whole child, right? And I also want you to take a look at like what they're like, kind of how they would get to that place, right? So they have like 3 things they call out is like equally high outcomes, like every kid can see over the fence, right? We can remove or kind of interrupt that predictability that certain kids would always kind of be the kid in purple, right? That kid in purple just kind of stays as kid in purple. And so how do we remove the predictability, understanding there's a system at play, that it's not that our kids aren't brilliant and amazing, but that there's a system that has constantly kind of perpetuated certain kids not having equally high outcomes. Okay, so we got to call that out and unpack it. The interruption of inequitable practices, which I think one of you called out a few moments ago. The concept of bias, right? So that's a big thing. I know your district has already engaged in anti-bias training and will continue to do that. But how do you remove those blind spots? Basically, the things we don't know about kids. That part of the baseball card, the stats below, the academics. Like, how do we really understand what kids need? And of course, it calls out recognizing the brilliance of kids, right? They all have unique gifts and talents. There is not one kid in Benicia Unified that is not brilliant and amazing. Every last one of them are, right? It's just how we measure success and then how we kind of engage with them may not all be the same based on what they need. Now, I'm going to give you another example. Keep that word in mind that's coming to mind. So Dr. Pedro Noguera, how many are familiar with Dr. Pedro Noguera? Okay, good. And Dr. Pedro's been in the business for some time. He's been a practitioner. He's opened schools. He continues to stay super busy. And he is now dean in USC, School of Education. But this video is a little bit, not dated per se, but I think this was, God, I can't remember how long ago. I know AXA had a chance to interview Dr. Noguera a couple of times. And so what you hear him say here is he's going to share a little perspective about equity. And I want you to listen to it. And afterwards, we're going to talk about what those words are that really describe equity to you. We're going to take a brain break, and then we're going to jump into our governance piece. Okay? All right. I think I probably forgot to push the sound button. All right, let me reshare. All right, there we go. All right, and just Diane, wave to me if you can hear him speaking.
In the context of education, the term equity has come to mean the need to focus more directly, not simply on equal opportunity, that is making sure that kids have access to schools and the opportunity theoretically to learn, but really focusing on outcomes and results. And the analogy I often make is most parents practice equity with their kids. That is, we don't treat all kids the same because they have different needs. And when in schools that are really focused on equity, they're trying to meet the different needs of kids and do so in ways with a focus on outcomes. Schools are set up to be the equalizer of opportunity. That was the mandate early on, was that we would use education to promote merit, to promote talent. And so theoretically, you'd want to make sure that all kids, regardless of background, got similar educational opportunities. But that's not what we do. Obviously, if you go to school in the South Bronx, you get a very different education than if you go to schools in Scarsdale. But what's more, even within schools, we exacerbate inequity because in many schools, there's a deliberate practice of assigning the best teachers to teach the highest achieving kids and the least effective and least experienced teachers to teach the high need kids. This never works, but schools consistently do it largely because it serves their political purposes of both appeasing the parents of the high achieving kids and appeasing teachers with seniority. Parents play a critical role in influencing what schools do, and sometimes they can exacerbate the inequities. And that's because the affluent parents who are highly educated and have lots of time on their hands can put pressure on the schools to get what they want. You can never blame a parent for trying to get the best for their kids. However, sometimes what that means is that some kids are getting more because their parents are able to put the pressure on, lobby the schools to get resources directed at their kids, whereas other parents either don't have the time, don't have the know-how, or aren't treated in the same way when they engage schools, and therefore their kids don't get served as well. Well, the only way to really create equitable schools is to really focus on that as your goal, and making sure that, first of all, you have good leaders who have a vision that combines a commitment to academic excellence to a commitment to equity. And that's important because in this country, we tend to see the two as being conflicting goals. We tend to think that the more we do for excellence, the less we'll be able to do for equity, because in our mind, there's only a small number of elite kids who are excellent, and we're going to give more to them. And that's what, for example, we were doing gifted programs. We give them the best, and then we forget about the rest of the kids. So we build in inequity. When we combine excellence and equity, what we're focused on is how do we make sure that all kids are exposed to high standards, quality teachers? How do we make sure that even the kids who come in who are further behind, who need more help, get that help? What we really should be aiming for are kids who are learning ideas, knowledge, and skills that they can apply to their own situation. So they can understand the utility of what they learn and how it's relevant to their life circumstances. So I'll give you one example. A teacher I was working with in Oakland, California, she had to teach environmental history, or environmental science rather, and she was interested in making connections between the students' lives that she was teaching and the subject. And so what she did, she asked me how she should approach it. And I said, why don't you spend some time exploring this neighborhood? And you might get some ideas about the most critical environmental issues in this neighborhood. And the neighborhood was West Oakland. It's a neighborhood that has a lot of heavy industry, a lot of traffic. It's an area with a lot of toxic sites. And as she drove the community, she saw that. She also saw that there were a lot of families in that community that had gardens in the backyard. And she imagined that many of those families were eating fruits and vegetables from those gardens and not aware of the fact that the soil was probably contaminated with lead that was coming into the soil from the atmosphere. So what she did was she designed a whole unit with her students, for her students, on the effects of lead in the environment. And it started by showing how lead goes from the industry or from the cars into the atmosphere, how it goes from the atmosphere into the soil through the rain, what happens when you how it goes from the soil into the plants, and then what happens when you ingest those plants, particularly in small children whose brains are first developing, and lead contamination really can have a very damaging effect on the development of children's brains. She then taught her kids how to do soil testing, and they went out into the community to test the soil for lead content, and they mapped where the lead contamination was greatest, and they produced these very intricate charts showing what was causing this contamination, that is, its proximity to a freeway or to a foundry or some other kind of heavy industry. After they produced the report, the kids were very concerned because of what they'd learned. And they said to the teacher that they felt they had to do more than merely produce the report, that they needed to do something with the information now. And she agreed, and they contacted the county health commissioner and approached the county health commissioner about doing something about this problem. And after reading their report, hearing them speak very intelligently and passionately about this problem, what the county health commissioner agreed to do was, first of all, send out a letter to all the residents in this neighborhood in West Oakland, warning them of the effects of toxics, lead contamination in the soil, but also offering free topsoil for any family that wanted gardens but didn't have the ability to get clean topsoil. And I often point that as an example because my bet is that those kids will know about the effects of lead in the environment forever. And that's because they were able to see how what they were learning could be used in a way that could really improve their lives and their community.
The last thing about improving their lives and their community. I love that example. All right, so before we take our break, we just saw the image that Diane really appreciates, the kids on the baseball field, right? Just kind of showing the difference of equity, equality, right? Two different things, right? Equity is not equality. It's not giving everybody the same thing. It's giving them what they need. Also, you saw the National Equity Project example of what equity is. I just want to add, you have a vision statement, which I think has a lot of equity context to it. And then you also heard Dr. Pedro Noguera. So going back to the question I asked you, if you could describe equity in one word, and I want you to write that word down now. Okay, so write that word down. And for those of you that just are so difficult, you can use a hyphenated word. No, some people are like, I can't do it in one word. So if you need a hyphenated word or you need to, go ahead and use two. But I wanted you to try to narrow to one word if you can. right? So just think about all the ways that you see equity individually to you as a person. What does equity mean in one word? Okay. All right. So as you've written that word down, now I want you to take a few moments to write down why you chose that word. So now you have the opportunity to be more loquacious, as I was told, and share more of your dissertation version of what does equity mean? Why did you choose that one word? So just go ahead and write it down. Cabinet members, I know you're participating kind of from a distance, but go ahead and participate in this activity in terms of your written piece, because I think this is really important to continue to do this in collaboration with our team, our board team. So again, writing down why you chose that word. All right, so give me your favorite Zoom reaction, so I know that you're done. When you're done, just give me your favorite Zoom reaction, which could just be that what Diane shared, that she got her Starbucks. Or you might have, you want to put the little heart or whatever, I don't know. Some of you are like, I still haven't figured out that feature, so don't worry about it. All right, so looks like I got a few more, so I just want to make sure. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to have our governance team. Your exit ticket to your break will be what I call a 30-second elevator speech. So as you all know, you are elected officials, so often you have like literally 30 seconds, right? Because you're busy. And also, if you've ever been in an elevator, right, you're shaking and moving when we were in person, in the elevator door, like it's opened up, it's time to go to the next floor. You got about 30 seconds and that person no longer is talking to you behind the elevator. Some of you have experienced that when we used to go to conferences together. It's like, I'll talk to you later, right? All right, so your 30-second elevator speech, keyword 30 seconds, that's it. I'm going to have a timer. I want you to share your definition of equity in 30 seconds, okay? So you have your cues right in front of you, which is fine. So you want to just take a look at it. But I want you to speak from your heart 30 seconds. Help me understand. And here's the context. I am what I call non-believer. Like, I don't believe that there are equity issues. I don't believe that. That data you show me, I'm not sure that really makes sense to me. So I'm a non-believer. So as you're sharing your elevator speech, convince me what equity actually means. Okay? All right, so I'll start with my timer, and again, I will cut you off if you go past 30 seconds. There's no offense. It's all out of love, but all you have is 30. So let me make sure my timer is on right. There it is. Okay, so who wants to go first? All right, Dr. Young wants to go first. All right, so we're going to have the governance team get ready, and Dr. Young is going to kick us off, and your 30 seconds starts now.
I'm just going first because I know what's going to come before me is going to be amazing. I would say equity is access as it centers on removing barriers and focuses on individual student needs and says, you can do it.
All right. Yes, time to yield. Wow. All right. So Dr. Young, to clarify, your word was access. I forgot to say if you could share the word, your one word.
I'm sorry.
Was it access?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I caught that. All right, cool. Powerful. All right, that's hard act to follow. Not even 30 seconds. All right, so we're going to start it over. All right, Sherry's next. Go.
My word was fairness, to make sure that we remove the barriers for all students so they all have an equal playing ground, and that we need to break the mold that we have been existing under, to create those possibilities, and also to remove our personal beliefs, to make sure that we are reaching all of our students.
All right,
Okay,
time.
time's up.
Time.
Thanks.
Great. Uh-oh. And I know you're on to something more, so don't forget the thoughts. I know it was 30 seconds, but I love it. Appreciate that. So I heard fairness, and I heard you call out a few things that I'm just kind of notating. So, all right, Sherry, perfect. All right, looks like Gethsemane. I see you, and then Sherry. Okay, I'm sorry, Cece. Okay, so Gethsemane, go ahead and go, and let me just shuffle. All right, go.
All right, so my word is individuality. I believe that we need to see students individually for who they are, and then also equip them with the tools that they need for success. We also need to understand what their goals are as well, but we just need to really be able to look at each student to be able to know who they are and what they need and to be able to help them to succeed.
Appreciate that. All right. So I heard the word individuality. Individuality. All right, perfect. Okay, Cece, you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right, go.
My word is mindfulness. And I chose that because we need to be aware of and understanding of the uniqueness of all our students. And we also need to be mindful of our own biases. That's it.
Nice. Powerful. Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Cece. All right, Mark, you ready?
No, but okay. Yes. No, I with equity, I couldn't come up with a word that meant equity to me outside of the word equity. And
okay.
Just the definition for me is just getting for the students what each student needs. And that's different than, I've seen the fence thing, and it's different than equality, which is giving everybody the same thing, because not everyone needs the same thing.
Yeah.
It's giving people what they need to be able to be successful.
Yeah.
And that, I know I couldn't come up with a different word to me that meant one single word that meant the same thing.
All right. Perfect. All right. Diane.
That would be me.
Okay,
ready? I did. I still couldn't come up with one word. I have two. So there you go.
Okay.
But for me, what's been playing in my mind over years is I think as we learn to appreciate and value the interests of others and begin to really capture and understand those, that we'll begin to break down some of the generalizations or assumptions that people make when they see people. And to me, that was important based on past experience with being in schools and being in education and personal life experiences. So I think that's important.
All right. And what were the two words themselves that you called out?
Interest and assumptions.
Interest. Okay. Ooh, I like that. All right. And so I know the staff, you all have yours, and this would be a great activity to do even in your own cabinet meeting. But I love the 30-second elevator speech. You notice what the governance team did is really shared very quickly what their vision is of equity. And one of the first questions to ask you is there a common belief of your vision statement across your district? That was one question. Now, as you heard each other's 30-second elevator speech and you kind of had discussion, would you say that you all have a common vision as a governance team and a common view of what equity is? Would you agree? Yeah. I mean, I heard different words.
Yeah, generally, I think everybody was in the same ballpark. Absolutely.
I think
I heard a lot about individual needs, big time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hear a lot of things that connect. I heard fairness, equity, individuality, mindfulness, interest, assumptions, and access, right? And what I also heard is in your speeches, you called out removing barriers kind of in your own different words, right? You called out removing bias, valuing, right, the differences, being aware of the uniqueness of each kid. So I heard each kid being called out, like understanding their goals, making sure they're successful, having equal opportunities to have that success. You all called out those things. And so I would like to say that as a governance team, like you're all having the same common vision around what equity is. And that's huge when we talk about effective governance, right? Is to have a common vision is important. And so this equity work, because it's so complex, you have to have that common vision, because now, guess what? We have a lens for which now we go into governance, where we're going to talk after our break about how you actually make decisions with an equity lens, how you come up with policy or implement policy with an equity lens, how you ask questions to your staff with an equity lens, how you respond to your community with an equity lens. You see how the work is all governance, but it's just with a different lens, right? A more clear lens around what equity is. And so I want to end with this, that elephant blind man picture. You're going to continue to do that because that's the process you actually just went through, right? If we had more extensive like retreat time, right? You have a whole day with the governance team, we'd really unpack why you chose those words and also your own personal stories, right? Because that's where often your lens comes from, is individually, you all have been impacted by receiving equitable outcomes, and you've also been impacted by not. And so you come with your own lens, which is amazing, but this is where we're going, is to be effective. We take those individual elevator speeches and we put them together as a team. And that's going to be required to do this work as the work gets harder, more messier, and you start to interrupt the system. We're going to talk about that after our break and go into our governance and our system work. All right. So let's put a pin in it for a moment, a little bit of non-closure. I don't know what breaks you normally take, but I was thinking for this one, you could do a 10-minute break. And then our next one, we may have just a 5-minute one towards, I don't know, maybe about 11:30-ish. I'm thinking I'm right before that. So you can all have another short break. Does that sound okay? All right, cool. So 10 minutes. So it's 10:37. So we'll come back at 10:47. Okay, 10:47. All right.
Want to restate that for people?
Yes. Okay. All right. So welcome back again from our break. Just really appreciate you all taking some time to go through your equity statement conversation and really talk about the why of this work. What is your vision around equity? And really to look at a common vision amongst all of us as a lens for the work you're going to do as a governance team. So now what we're going to do is transition into a little bit of a bridge into your governance, right? Like what does that look like on the ground level for you in your decision making? And that bridge is really to talk about, one, what equity is, but then like, what are the challenges? Like, why don't we have equity in our school district, right? Like, why is our vision not coming to fruition? Like, why is this so difficult? Why are we here in the first place? So I'm going to share a little bit of the barriers for a moment, and it's going to kind of really be a recap because most of us have seen some of this. We're going to go a little bit deeper and have a discussion about some of the barriers to the work. So I'm just going to go back to our slide deck just to make connections for you. And in particular, I'm going to share this slide just to kind of show you the bridge that we're making now. Okay, so we spent quite a bit of time talking about what equity means, right? And so, again, it's not equality, right? It's not giving everybody the same thing. It's giving kids what they need. And you all did a phenomenal job with your 30-second elevator speeches about articulating that. But more importantly, like, what are the challenges to having this equitable opportunity and outcomes for kids? What are the challenges to equity? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And specifically, we're going to talk about like the historical context, because ultimately, as a governance team, you signed up to be in the public education system at the policy level. And there's some history behind policy that existed before you jumped onto the board. So we want to talk about history for a moment and make sure that we really have a good understanding of what's getting in the way. You all called out barriers. What are those barriers? And then at the end of our session today, we'll actually bridge our kind of governance work with what do we do? And this is going to be more around supporting some of your action steps. And so it's going to connect directly to your water of system change article. So I'm not going to go too deep into what are the actions just yet. I want to just kind of focus on the barriers right now, the challenges. Okay. So here in particular is a slide that kind of helps us think about like, what are the gaps? Okay. So remember, you have data, like you have your quantitative data. And again, Dr. Beeson's done a great job of giving you all those updates at your board meetings, kind of talking about the data itself. It really connects well with that reality box, I think, of the kids at the baseball game, right? Like you see equity gaps is what we call them. So we have kids who are performing based on our metrics at this space, and then we have kids performing at this space. And so when we talk about why does that gap exist, why are they not all at this place, we got to talk about the why. And one of the things I always want to remind us of is the kid in purple who's not able to see over that fence. It's not because it's a bad thing that they're shorter than the other kids. It's just that they're different, right? They have different gifts and talents. And so we have to look at it as all kids are gifted and talented, but somehow how they show that gifted and talentedness is not showing up in our metrics. Okay, so that typical gap shows up as an achievement gap, which is more academic. It shows up in our discipline data, and we call it disproportionality gap, which basically means that we have this number of kids as far as a whole population, but this smaller number of kids seems to be the most have the most suspensions and referrals and expulsions, but they're the smallest part of our community. So what happens is we call it disproportionate, right? Is they're a very small number, but they make up the largest number of referrals and suspensions. Okay, so that's a gap. There's something going on there we got to unpack. Access gap is important for you as a governance team to recognize, is that sometimes shows up in what we call our master scheduling process, right? So you know that every principal places kids in conjunction with teachers. There's a whole process for how we place kids in classes, okay, from elementary all the way to the high school. And so sometimes what you see is an access gap. Certain kids don't have access to higher level courses. And I know that's something you're looking at, right? Advanced courses, AP, honors, you name it. And then you also have this nuance of access to what I call quality, which is what Dr. Pedro Noguera called out, or also experienced teachers. So what sometimes happens is teachers may not be the right match for kids, right? You have great teachers, but what you may not have is the right match. So the master scheduling kind of shows these access gaps where I may have certain needs. There's a certain teacher that works better for me than another teacher. It's not saying the teacher's a bad teacher. It's just that's not what I need. I need this teacher who connects to me. And one of the things we'll also notice is experienced teachers, right? Sometimes we have our veteran teachers who are amazing at what they do, but they're not matched with the kids who have the most needs sometimes. And so what that means is we'll have our newer teachers who just come fresh out of the credentialing program, great teachers, right? But they're not as experienced. They don't have the same tools and strategies yet. So what that means sometimes it's a harder process for them. And I was one of those teachers, right? Like, I think I was a really good teacher, but I was like brand new. And I tell you, to this day, I tease my former principal about why I had 40 kids in my class and why I had certain kids who just like took all the energy out of the whole school and they all were in my class, right? And so we laugh at it now because I remember being told, oh, it's just random. The system just randomly puts kids in class. And now that I know better, we still have jokes about that conversation. It was more about they thought I was the best fit for them, but I was still a new teacher. So there were moments that I may have been able to have strategies that I didn't have my first and second year, right? So my point is that creates access, a gap. And the fourth one is the opportunity gap. We've heard of this one. And this one, a good example is, again, in your master scheduling and also in your process for supporting students like your English learners. As you know, they come into the system, they speak some brilliant language and beautiful language besides English. And so they end up in a course, right? They have different levels of instruction around ELD and really like interventions and ways that you all support English learners. So what happens in that track is they continue through the process. If they're not reclassified and considered to be English proficient, then what that looks like is they become, we call long-term English learners. And then they matriculate to the middle and the high school. You know what happens? Over time, they're taking courses that may be slightly different because they have to be proficient in English. So what that means is I can't take certain electives, I can't take certain classes. And then what happens? Oh, we get to graduation. And now that A through G vision we have for all of our kids, that opportunity gap becomes very much real because they may not be able to be college and career ready through A through G because of their coursework. So we have to talk about that as an opportunity gap. And again, it's not because our English learners aren't brilliant, but we do have a system that we have to revisit. Like, why do we have that gap? And so that's all of these gaps I bring up as kind of common gaps that show up in districts. But as a board, what we have to do as a team is ask those questions about not only what gaps exist in our district, right? So just knowing the data. When you're talking to community members, you got to know the data. You have to be very aware of this is why we're doing our equity work, because we have these gaps in our district. That's why. Okay, when people may not believe or understand there's a problem, there are gaps in the district, right? And I'm going to give you one that really shows up that's really hard sometimes for us to see is that, remember I talked about that word monolithic, right? Where we have certain kids who kind of mark the same demographic box, right? And what we'll find is that we'll see groups of kids who show up in this particular kind of bottom of the equity gap. And over time, they constantly show up like year after year after year. And even though there's brilliance within that ethnic group or that demographic group, there's still this gap that keeps showing up like this reality box here, right? 10 years ago, it looked like that. 15 years ago, it looked like that, right? And hopefully not 5 years from now, the gap will stay the same. We want to make sure that the predictability of some of these gaps for certain student groups do not continue. And that's important to recognize, like, why now? Okay, so when folks are like, okay, I see the data, I see it, I still don't believe it. I still don't believe it. And oh, by the way, there's a link here, which I'm not going to go deep into, but I'll just kind of remind you there's multiple places to look at data, right? You all have your data dashboard that shows up that is public to everyone, right? I know that Dr. Beatson uses that and alludes to the data dashboard, which is like your big picture data. And then you also have like your more district-wide data, your benchmarks, iReady, and everything that you use to look at data within. But there's also an interesting website, which I'm not going to go deep into, but just to share that actually is a public domain that people can take a look. And it's called Miseducation Data. And the reason why they bring it up is they talk about how kids being served in school districts, and this is national data. You can look at any district in America. But this particular website just alludes to some of the reality of the fact that we have kids who may not be served well in the system. And you can see it over and over. So if you pull up Benicia, you literally can see Benicia, and you can compare to other districts who are like you. And what they do in districts who are different. And so this is pretty outdated. So it's not something you want to look at as far as like now, because it's national data. So usually just like our California California dashboard is always outdated when we see it. This is very outdated, but it gives you a big picture, right? So when we talk to folks about why are we doing this work, and you see some of the divides that are happening, and they break down like racial data, they break down literally the achievement gap, and they call out certain subgroups that you all have called out. And so it's just interesting data to look at, to just have a conversation. Again, some of it is not going to be accurate, so don't get too caught up on that, because just like our California dashboard is not accurate because it's older data, this is more a national kind of comparison to some of the things that show up across our nation when you look at these same things, like kids who are enrolled in different courses. So it's just interesting to see. And so you're going to find it's going to be pretty outdated, but it's going to be very relevant to the big picture. And so when you talk about why do we have gaps in our schools, and I should say even what are the gaps, this is going to be important for you as board members to know how to speak to this, right? You don't have to have all the like details, but you do want to have some real context around, like, convince me, what are you talking about when you say why you're doing this work? I'm still not understanding that. And I want you to be able to feel comfortable speaking to it through the data. Okay, so very important. Now, the bigger piece of this is the why. Okay, so why are these gaps even existing in the first place? And you may recall this particular image that I often like to use to remind us about like the history of public education, in terms of really recognizing that the system has always kind of had some flawed metrics, right? Like it's that equality thing, like everybody gets the same test, right? But we know each individual kid is different. So what do you see here? Like he's Albert Einstein's calling out this, everybody's a genius, but if we judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll live its whole life believing it's stupid, right? And so as you look at this, you'll notice each of the animals have different gifts and skills and assets. But unfortunately, that one metric of climbing the tree is not going to always show the brilliance of that fish, for example, right? And that's something we have to reimagine, is how are we measuring that potential that you all called out when you talked about your vision statement, right? How do you measure that?
The thing to me, though, is I get what you're saying, but the state, there's still that standardized test. And that's all we're still judged on metrics, and, that doesn't change. It's good that we're, doing all this stuff, but those kids still got to take that test. And, regardless of whether they're good test takers or whatever else, and how do you get around that part? Because if that dude sitting in the chair behind the desk is a state, he's still judging us on how well we taught a fish to climb a tree.
He is.
And if that fish can't climb the tree, then, it's a ding on us, man. They don't care that, they don't look to that extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, Mark, where we have to, I call it reimagine education, right, as policymakers. So yes, you're right. There's some things that are out of our control. And I always want to acknowledge that, from not only the federal space, but also state, right? Like we have things that come down to us at the local level. Now, here's the tricky part, is that we have, again, remember those gaps I showed you, right? So like the discipline piece, you all can look at attendance, right? There's lots of factors that go into that top bullet point of achievement, right? Which is like the state test, for example. So when you think about this, your vision statement had the word engaging, inspiring, and challenging, right? And so when I go back to like this piece here, yes, that metric may not be something that the fish could really show its brilliance, but to balance the story out, right? And to change the experience of the fish so that there is a different way of even not feeling stupid. I just want to call that out, right? Like I was that kid, right? So I didn't do well on the SAT, for example. And honestly, my child doesn't do well on the SAT. Brilliant kid. I feel like I was brilliant. I feel like I have some form of success. Someone may agree, but I didn't do well on that test. Right. And I'm thankful that colleges kind of looked at like, maybe that's not the only thing we should look at anymore. Right. But the reality is this, is that in schools, if I don't feel like I can be successful, because the only way you celebrate success in the school system is that you have a good test taker on the state exam, and everything builds around that. That's where we also perpetuate what we call stereotype threat, which is a whole centered around, I keep telling that fish, you're not smart. You're not smart. You're not smart. Right? I keep saying it. I'm going to go back to this image here, the kid in purple. the messaging that you don't do well on the test, you don't do well on the test. So eventually the concept of stereotype threat, which is something, the work of Claude Steele, if you ever want to take a look at his book called Whistling Vivaldi. And it talks about this same thing, about the concept of testing. If I tell you, you're not going to do well on the test. Oh, by the way, this data our kids know, right? They know it very clearly who always shows up not doing well on the test. After a while, I'm going to believe that I'm not supposed to do well on that test. And so you know what happens? The self-fulfilling prophecy shows up. And then what we see is the exact demonstration of you're not going to do well on that test, and they don't. And I know that's a hard thing to see, but you got to look at the research. And I always tell people, you don't believe it, go look at Claude Steele work. He actually has done case studies around this, and knowing that you can change the narrative for our kids and send a message that constantly makes them feel stupid, because our only metric is that test. But remember, we have multiple metrics we use. And you know what's so interesting? If I have an inspiring, engaging, and challenging environment, I'm going to come to school every day. I'm going to engage in the classroom, and then I get great feedback, and I always get people have high expectations for me and send me multiple messages of my brilliance. After a while, guess what happens with test scores? They actually increase. I've done it. I just, by the way, I've done it, right? But we got to remember there's a system at play. And I want to remind you of one thing that's super important. You remember the history of public education? Y'all remember the timeline we looked at? Okay. And again, we're not going to go deep into the timeline because you've seen it. You can definitely go back to it. I always say governance teams, it's good to go back to history of policy in education. But I want to remind you of one particular event on the timeline. It was in 1948 with the testing piece, right? And that testing really is centered in history. And historically, when you look at the research and they talk about calling out some of our current testing system, right? The ETS is one that we still see to this day. And when you look at the history, one is these particular tests were funded by great grants, right? Of how do we like test our kids' brilliance so that we can feed into the system of, remember, we have a history of what public education was designed for. And it wasn't for college and career readiness. It wasn't for go be brilliant and go be innovative and be a gazillionaire, right? And build your own business.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for that.
It's to go work in a factory, man.
It was, but even more, remember the research of eugenicists, and you got to look that up, right? Eugenicists was really more around like research around people being genetically inferior.
Right.
There's a history to that. So if we don't recognize that the history of that type of research, which then became, they kind of call like a pseudoscience, right? Like it becomes like real for us, but it's really not. And so this here they call out like when we talk about proving that immigrants were feeble-minded, right? So remember, immigrants that we're referring to here is not immigrants of what kind of our current context, right? We're talking about European immigrants. Remember, millions of European immigrants who came to the country, right? And remember, the schooling system wasn't even allowed for everyone. So we got to talk about the history of testing was not just centered in what some would say, oh, it's about culturally biased tests and it's about racism and all that. You got to look at the history of public education. It wasn't designed for everybody to be seen as brilliant. It was designed to put people in that workspace. So I'll do this real quick just for the visual, for those of you that are like from the community, they're like, what in the world are they talking about? So this was the timeline that we got a chance to take a look at. And again, I'm not going to go deep into it because you've had a chance to, but I want to remind you a few highlights. Because remember, 1647 was kind of the beginning of that public education concept. But that was just from our colonist families coming over, right? It was a small number of European colonists who came over. And remember, it was about teaching concepts of the Bible, right? It was teaching like literacy and more of a belief system. And this, you know, colonist families at this point, it was like elementary level. We weren't even talking about high school at the time. But also it was around like Thomas Jefferson kind of talked about like a 2-track system. Well, this was the 1-track system. People who were landowners, right, who had some sense of wealth. And so it wasn't about poor people being educated, right? It wasn't about the things that we sometimes see now where it's like it's about all kids. It wasn't about all kids. So we got to be very clear without looking at history. Then it's harder to see like why we even have some of these gaps. And so I think, Mark, what you're referring to is the 1820 to 1860s when we had a large influx of immigrants from Europe. right? And so what you see here is that then we started to transition to that industry, that factory kind of space, right? We needed people to work in the industry. And so what do you see? The owners of industry needed what they call a docile and obedient workforce. So they used public schools to create that, right? Unfortunately, that's not the portrait of your graduate in Benicia Unified, right? Yours is a little bit more evolved. And so that's why it's important when you look at the advancements that have happened, but also some of the ways that we've perpetuated inequality, not even equity. I don't even think equity was a concept here. Equality was the battle now. When you start to look at the timeline and you start to see the evolution, right, of where we had advancements, but also we had some very much oppressive ways of keeping certain students from being educated. And I hate to break it to us, but remember, California is really a highlight in this particular timeline, where we see, and I'm trying to get not go too fast, but you can see, where our Native American brothers and sisters and their children, right, were kind of culture kind of destroyed. You have to assimilate to American schools, right? Like we still see that concept today where some of our kids don't feel like they actually are part of a school system that represents and recognizes their own culture. They're trying to assimilate to something different, right? And so these are all things that we have to recognize. But I just want to pull out California just so you all can see that our school district has some interesting history. I'm sorry, our state has some interesting history. Okay, so notice California. We had the formula of 10, right? Which speaks a lot about why our schools are so segregated, right? We have our political code about the governing body being able to exclude children. And in this case, it was more about what they called vicious and filthy habits, and specifically calling it out for kids who have Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian parentage. It's an interesting concept. It almost sounds similar to what we're seeing with some of our anti-Asian kind of hate, right? And a lot of it related to a pandemic. It's interesting how you see some things just kind of show up. This is history. This is not now. None of us were part of this, right? So we can't really even we can't say it's our fault that these are kind of the historical nuances, but what we can do and have to do as a governance team is we have to recognize that we have inherited a system that has history. And that's important to recognize. Now, what is my role? Because we have a system that has history. Okay. And so very important that as a community that is watching kind of the work you're doing and why, again, you're doing this work, it's because historically you have a system that was not designed to serve and support all kids. It just wasn't designed to be equitable. And so I want to do this for you. I want to just have a brief discussion before we connect this to policy. Okay. So these particular questions, when you think about the first two questions, like what was the purpose, okay, and kind of how's it impacting us now, that is something we got to think about, right? What was the purpose? And then now that you've jumped on the board, like, okay, well, how is this affecting us now? Right. So I want to pause and see what your thoughts are about those two questions. And then we're going to actually jump into the last two questions in our governance work. So I just want to open it up for a little dialogue. Anybody jump in? What was the purpose? And then maybe how do you see connections to it impacting us now? Because none of us were around when the history of public education started, but we've inherited this system. How's it impacting us now?
I'll take a stab at the first one, and I think, continue to try to be very mindful of it. Mark made me think of it that a lot of times public education was designed for the Industrial Revolution model. Henry Ford's model of efficiency, scale, that you could, put the greatest number of students with one teacher in a space. So it was scale and it was efficiency. It was the uniformity of the end product, if you will, to plug in to definitely a much simpler workscape when it was designed. So there is that industrial age concept to the model.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Simi, jump in. Dr. Moss.
I was going to say for me, I just always think about it wasn't really designed for like innovative thinking, creative, being creative or anything like that. So So I can see where that still is perpetuated within our system. But then I also, just looking at all the different charter schools, just online, whatever schools that, these private schools that have developed. And then I started to think about, well, gosh, we always talk about how charter schools and other schools, take away from the funding of the public school. But then I also in the back of my mind, I'm always asking like, well, what, how are we missing the mark where if, people feel like they have to go that route, like, what are we doing to continue to not really create, successes? Well, while some kids, yes, are very successful in the system, but we know that all students aren't successful. And then for us, just being able to just be a little more creative with what we're doing, because I've seen over the years where people are really good at just perpetuating the same stuff that they become great. We pat each other on the back at all of our different awards. I think about even like with AXA, we go down, we have these celebrations of successes, but I just, I kind of feel like, well, are we really just perpetuating the same system? So I've been asking myself the question just over the past few days, like who is really is benefiting from this system? Like who is really benefiting from the system? Because right now, question. Looking at the data, over time, it certainly hasn't been all of the students. It's more adults who benefited from the education system. So that's what it kind of makes me think about.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, I think as educators, I think we know this. I know I've done tons of training and have talked to people about how the development of education seemed to stop with the Industrial Revolution. And I don't know why that is, except I think it was more concrete to be able to shoot for as a goal. Because the conversations I used to have when I was going through this was, now we're in an era, and Gethsemane, I think it gets back to your piece of creativity. We're not in an era anymore of building factories. We're in an area right now of intellectual growth. And that's not concrete. So how do you build towards that? How do you prepare kids for that? And I think, I think in some of our own ways, we're trying to do it, yet I think we're way behind the curve when we talk about bringing kids forward with technology and coding. Everybody looks at that as a computer, but when in fact we're in an age of intellectual growth. Yeah, we're not in an age of stuff anymore.
Interesting. Good
and
point.
That's and I think that's part of where education hasn't gotten, the system of education has not gotten there yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I know I'm jumping ahead of somebody else, but it just made me think about how can we the whole part around creativity, because our system is kind of designed to think a certain way,
right?
A certain way, and
have the right answer.
Right. And it's it's not, we're just not like that as human beings.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And for me as a creative person, I've struggled, just because I'm like, oh my goodness, this is so I just want to go to sleep.
Yeah, good point. And right. It's funny you mentioned that, Dr. Moss, because when Mark said, okay, but we got to give that standardized test still, right? And I was one that I think maybe that's why I didn't do as well on the standardized test, because I think I might have fallen asleep a few times, right? But how do we bridge that connection, knowing that we jumped into a system that was never designed to be equitable? That's the biggest piece. The biggest question you have to tackle as a governance team is you have a system that you jumped into, right? Voluntarily, by the way. Some of you were in education the majority of your life, right? So this is just kind of also how we've known it. So when you think about how do we maybe perpetuate, going to question 3, how would we perpetuate this? Some of it is just because it's always how we've done things. Right. And so some people are going to push back and say, why are you creating new policies or changing the policies that have always been around for long before you jumped on the board?
That
and
have
some
worked
of the
forever.
Pushback is that. Yes, say it again, Diane.
I said, and have worked forever.
And right. And so this is all we know, right? So part of it is really, again, asking ourselves, what are we doing to possibly perpetuate and just own it? We have to own this is a system we lead, even though we didn't create it. Right. And I think that's I call it the forgive ourselves for the things that we just, we may have not known. And two is we weren't responsible for the system being created the way it was. What we are responsible for, I think, is that fourth question is our role in interrupting. And that's where we got to continue to have dialogue with each other. And when we have those moments where we're trying to consider change, we got to go back to, like, again, what is our role as governance team? Because we have a lot of power, even though we have some mandates around standardized testing, right? We have some compliance metrics around budget and resource allocation, because we have some frameworks, right? We have to follow. But there's a whole lot of room for us to reimagine student success through the metrics that matter to us. Even though those state tests might show up on the dashboard, guess what? Our ways of reimagining student success will actually, I believe, increase the achievement in that test. That's the part that's so important to this work. All right, real quick, Dr. Young, and then I'm going to jump into a video for you all so we can keep
super quick. Dr. Moss and all this stuff about creativity. This is a fabulous book by Sir Ken Robinson. I think we all know his. He has 2 TED Talks. I think they're one of the 2 of the most watched ones ever. This is Creative Schools, the Grassroots Revolution That's Transforming Public Education. But he talks about the importance of creativity, and then in doing it well, you can have increased performance. Back to Mark's really important point on those, inevitable required tests. I just wanted to put the plug into this for a fabulous. Thank you for the reminder.
Thanks for the resource.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I want to keep this conversation going, and I want to actually throw a little monkey wrench in here for a moment. And I want to share a video because I think that there's a great opportunity right now to reimagine, like, the fact that you all are opening schools. And so leveraging this opportunity, right? You all know the system was never designed to be equitable. And honestly, those equity gaps were kind of like by design, right? Like, it wasn't designed for everyone to show brilliance. Like, that's just the history. So as you rethink, like, reopening schools, because you're bringing kids back, right? You're bringing kids back, and then you go into the fall and you'll have, I hate saying it, like, I'm not sure what it'll look like. I think everyone's struggling with this now. Like, what will this look like? Where will we be in the pandemic? Like, a lot of unknowns this year. I know it's been very frustrating for everyone who's involved, parents, kids, obviously staff as well. But how do we leverage this opportunity to reopen schools with an equity lens? And this is where you're at in the moment as a governance team, right? This is where you're at. So as we reopen, I say bringing back kids, getting to whatever our new normal is. I want you to take a look at this video. And this particular video is a gentleman named Prince E. I'm not sure how many of you have had a chance to hear his he has lots of different videos where he depicts, like, different moments in society. And so this particular one, I want you to take a look at, because he's actually kind of calling us out as a school system. He's actually suing us, right? He's in a courtroom depicting, like, this suing of the school system. And I want you to hear some of the things that come up when he talks about that creativity, right? And he talks about, like, what Diane and Gethsemane both talked about is just, like, the experiences in schools that may be able to look a little different. Okay. So I call it a CAP moment, which is really just kind of write down, like, what's confirmed for you, what question you may have, and what emotion is provoked, right? That's a CAP moment. And often this is really cool way to just pause and reflect on what we see. So let me reshare. Go ahead while I cue up the video.
Before you run the video, I just want to share a conversation that I had with a couple of other people. And we also shared it at, I don't know, Leslie, which one of those CAP meetings were we on? But we said, actually, I think we're in a real exciting time right now in education. Yes, and I think what we need to do is we need to capitalize on the moment. We are in such a good space to be able to recreate what school looks like. You get rid of all those things. And I wish I could remember the educational term. I can't, it's escaped me. It's been too long. But you clean off, you look at the table and you clean it off and you say, we've been doing all these things because we have. And no one could give you a good purpose or a good reason for why we're doing what we're doing, but we do it because we have. And it's really, it's a great time to really evaluate what we do, how we do it, and what's really important. So I think going forward, I think this is one of those times that we could say it was industrial, but now we're 2021, and let's look forward and let's do what really matters. So
absolutely. And Diane, thank you for saying that, because here's what my brain thought of as a parent as you were talking, because I have kids, like 3 kids with 3 different needs. And what I heard you say is I can envision that the philosophy you just shared is actually good for all 3 of my kids.
Well, I believe
it's not going to take, and it's not going to take from someone's kid who that system may have benefited for a while, right? So I think that's the piece we have to wrestle with, is equity for kids is good for all kids. Right. Because those kids who are doing super well, like I would never want to interrupt doing well, right? Like I don't want that to be the thought, but it's about all kids being able to have the equal opportunity to do well, right? And I think that's the piece we have to think about. So I'm going to share this video and let's see what kind of comes up for you. Make sure the sound is working. And again, just kind of sit back and relax and think about what's confirmed for you and what questions may come up and what emotions may be provoked as you watch the video. All right, looks like the sound is going okay.
Albert Einstein once said, everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today on trial we have modern day schooling. Glad you could come. Not only does he make fish climb trees, but also makes them climb down and do a 10-mile run. Tell me, school, are you proud of the things you've done? Turning millions of people into robots, do you find that fun? Do you realize how many kids relate to that fish swimming upstream in class, never finding their gifts, thinking they are stupid, believing they are useless? Well, the time has come, no more excuses. I call school to the stand and accuse him of killing creativity, individuality, and being intellectually abusive. He's an ancient institution that has outlived his usage. So, Your Honor, this concludes my opening statement, and if I may present the evidence of my case, I will prove it. Proceed. Exhibit A. Here's a modern-day phone. Recognize it? Here's a phone from 150 years ago. Big difference, right? Stay with me. Here's a car from today, and here's a car from 150 years ago. Big difference, right? Well, get this. Here's a classroom of today, and here's a class we used 150 years ago. Now, ain't that a shame? In literally more than a century, nothing has changed. Yet you claim to prepare students for the future? But with evidence like that, I must ask, do you prepare students for the future or the past? I did a background check on you and let the record show that you were made to train people to work in factories, which explains why you put students in straight rows, nice and neat, tell them sit still, raise your hand if you want to speak, give them a short break to eat, and for 8 hours a day, tell them what to think. Oh, and make them compete to get an A letter which determines product quality, hence grade A of meat. I get it. Back then, times were different. We all have a past. I myself am no Gandhi. But today, we don't need to make robot zombies. The world has progressed. And now we need people who think creatively, innovatively, critically, independently, with the ability to connect. See, every scientist will tell you that no 2 brains are the same. And every parent with 2 or more children will confirm that claim. So please explain why you treat students like cookie cutter frames or snapback hats, giving them this one-size-fits-all crap. Watch your language. Sorry, Your Honor, but if a doctor prescribed the exact same medicine to all of his patients, the results will be tragic. So many people would get sick, yet when it comes to school, this is exactly what happens. This educational malpractice, where one teacher stands in front of 20 kids, each one having different strengths, different needs, different gifts, different dreams, and you teach the same thing the same way? That's horrific. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant should not be acquitted. This may be one of the worst criminal offenses ever to be committed. And let's mention the way you treat your employees. Objection. Overruled. I want to hear this. It's a shame. I mean, teachers have the most important job on the planet, yet they're underpaid? No wonder so many students are short-changed. Let's be honest. Teachers should earn just as much as doctors, because a doctor can do heart surgery and save the life of a kid, but a great teacher can reach the heart of that kid and allow him to truly live. See, teachers are heroes that often get blamed, but they're not the problem. They work in a system without many options or rights. Curriculums are created by policymakers, most of which have never taught a day in their life. Just obsessed with standardized tests. They think bubbling in a multiple choice question will determine success. That's outlandish. In fact, these tests are too crude to be used and should be abandoned, but don't take my word for it. Take Frederick J. Kelly, the man who invented rigid standardized testing, who said, and I quote, "These tests are too crude to be used and should be abandoned." Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if we continue down this road, the results will be lethal. I don't have much faith in school, but I do have faith in people. And if we can customize healthcare, cars, and Facebook pages, then it is our duty to do the same for education, to upgrade it, change it, do away with school spirit, because that's useless unless we're working to bring the spirit out of each and every student. That should be our task. No more Common Core. Instead, let's reach the core of every heart in every class. Sure, math is important, but no more than art or dance. Let's give every gift an equal chance. I know this sounds like a dream, but countries like Finland are doing impressive things. They have shorter school days. Teachers make a decent wage. Homework is non-existent, and they focus on collaboration instead of competition. But here's the kicker, boys and girls. Their educational system outperforms every other country in the world. Other places like Singapore are succeeding rapidly. Schools like Montessori, programs like Khan Academy, there is no single solution. But let's get moving, because while students may be 20% of our population, they are 100% of our future. So let's attend to their dreams, and there's no telling what we can achieve. This is a world in which I believe, a world where fish are no longer forced to climb trees. I'll rest my case.
All right. So as you listen to the perspective, interesting perspective around just reimagining schools, I think is what the message is. And obviously in a courtroom, he's kind of calling out the whole school system, right, across the board. I think at all levels, right, federal, state, local levels, you name it. But just want to take just a few moments before we bridge into now, what does this mean for you as a board? Any thoughts that you have as we conclude our space and thinking about the system? Yeah, jump in, Sherry.
Oops. I was just going to say, it makes me really sad. Yeah. Watching that just makes me really sad, because these are things that we all want to make sure, like, we're not just reaching the core group of the higher achievers, but we're reaching other groups that can equally highly achieve in a different environment. And I think it's really important for us as board members to look at the bigger picture and not just focus on what has been done for so many years, like that 150-year span. We need to customize education. It just made me really sad watching that, because I believe a lot of what he alluded to.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Sherry.
The same way, Sherry. I was feeling, for me, it definitely stirred up a lot for me, just because, I think about the idea of creativity, the killing of creativity, preparing students for the past. And I know that there has been some progress, but I also still know that there is a huge gap. And so for me, I do feel like we're in a good place and space where we could create something different, because if we don't, somebody else will, which means that our students will be going wherever, families will make sure that their kids are where they're going to be, where they're going to be successful. And so I just feel like we can definitely do a better job with creating options. I also realize that our systems feed into each other. So we have our district, office, then we got the county office, then we got the California Department of Education. So again, you have people in these different places who unfortunately are not, they're not understanding and thinking the same way, just like was alluded to in the video. You have people, who've never either been in a classroom, who don't know a thing about education, but yet and still they're the people who make these decisions in terms of putting a rubber stamp on everything that we're supposed to be doing, with no innovative skills whatsoever. So yeah, it stirred up a lot for me as a person, again, who is a creative person. I struggle.
Yeah. Good point.
It makes me actually pretty upset too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Cece, I'm gonna ask you to jump in. You have thoughts about not just the video, but any context that we've shared, kind of like the why we have these gaps and just even reimagining. I'm just curious of your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I'm not hopeful that I love this video. I think this video speaks to the heart of what education should be. But I'm not hopeful that any change will occur. I think, as Gethsemane said, that we have all these systems, and I think there's a lot of failure in our systems. So, and I have to say, there's such there is resistance, a lot of resistance to these ideas. I love that he also brought up Finland, because I've always been fascinated with the way Finland, their education works. So yeah, I have to say, I'm not hopeful. I think there's too much resistance.
I appreciate you sharing that, Cece. I think I've had many of these dialogues, and I will say even my own personal experiences doing this, like personally and professionally, I've had many a nights where I'm like, there's just no hope, right? Like, I totally get what you're saying. And I think what I also hear Gethsemane saying, and I think I heard a little bit from Diane, and even Sherry, is this piece about, while there's this lack of hope, because I get it, right? And I think that lack of hope resonates through like our entire system too, including our kids, which is why I know that when I think of that last question, like, what is our role in interrupting these things? I think the hope I have is that because you all have power, there actually is hope. Because guess how systems change? There's a leveraging point, right? And usually power structures is what help. It's a part of shifting and having that change, which is where, in our kind of last part of our discussion we'll have is around the article you read, right? And actually, so there's a piece of hope that I think we got to hold on to. But what I hear you saying, Cece, which is super important, and we really won't go deep in today, but you're right. There's a resistance. And part of what I think we were doing today is, as we learn together as a governance team, we're building up our tools as what I call equity leaders to combat some of the resistance. Because to be fair, and in that article, like, it talks about like the fish like swimming in the water, and that one fish comes up and says, how's the water? And the other fish is like, what's water? A lot of the resistance is it's not that they don't want to do the work. It's more about, and I think if I remember, Cece, I just wrote, I didn't write everything down as far as who said what for this piece, but I think I remember you saying like that mindfulness piece was connected to that awareness of the uniqueness of kids, but then the mindfulness of our own biases. Was that yours?
Yes, that was mine.
Yeah. And I think you called out that resistance is more about just lack of awareness, right? Of needing to change. Like, that's why I am hopeful. And I've actually seen people change. So I'll share that. And this is why I do what I do, right? Is because one of the reasons why it's hard for us to change is because we just don't know what's water. We didn't even realize it was a problem. So therefore you come to me and say, hey, like, I want you to change the grading policy, right? I want you to change all these things that have been inequitable. And I'm going to resist, because I've only known that water that way. And so, to be fair, I think we have to be okay and open to the fact we should expect resistance. But once we know and expect that, then we can respond more effectively, I think. Go ahead.
Well, I think that, I don't know, I'm filtering, and I think I'll let it go.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. And Cece, remember the fourth agreement is expect and accept non-closure. This is absolutely like a healthy space to be in, is that we do have to question how we're going to do this work. Because, I think
what happens is that sometimes, we look at things, we look at data and we're well-meaning, and we want to progress.
Right.
But then we don't look, our systems, and I mean the whole system, doesn't see through that lens of equity. They still, sometimes we get stuck in that, in that singular space.
Yes.
And the article really spoke of the flow of water, and then it kind of gets dammed up, right?
Yeah. But in Cece, I think we have to always push ourselves. Why is it getting dammed up? And I think that's the people in the system, right? It kind of calls out like the power dynamics, the relationships. And then the biggest and hardest part, honestly, is the mindset. And that's why professional learning is so important. I know I really am excited that your district's looking at how do we provide just space for even educators to even learn about what equity is, because this is not what our system was designed for. And for those of us that were teachers, right, when we went through learning how to be an educator, this wasn't what was taught to us. Even something as simple as the history of public education, like the waters we're swimming in, and we jumped in. None of us really got that version of history. We took a lot of history classes, but we somehow as educators didn't get the history of public education. I'll even say when you look at like policing, right? Like the police force has been like in the spotlight, right? And there's a lot of systems that should be in the spotlight around what we can re-envision. But I'll even say, like if I was a police officer going into the trainings process, right? And going through, what do you call it? Boot camp, you name it. Like, is the history of policing taught to police officers? No. And so why we see some of this historical pushback is we don't really realize like, oh my God, this is a system that has history of what we're seeing on TV right now. And without teaching people who are in the system that weren't responsible for starting the system, that's why the resistance is so deep. And that's why we have to be in a space like we're doing today of just professional learning, giving us a chance to wrestle with your truth, CC, which is big. And we have to hold on to that is we can't be resistant ourselves, but we got to recognize like, how do we build our capacity to respond to the resistance, which is going to take time. This is a go slow to go fast process. Very important.
But also I was saying that, you know, we have to be aware of our own biases,
Absolutely.
and especially in leadership. If we're not aware and we're not available to see our own biases and our own roadblocks, then
that's powerful.
Then that's where the dam comes in, and it's
absolutely
that dam backs up that water flow.
Right, and that's why we're here today. So I appreciate you calling.
I think Cece's comment is so interesting and powerful for many reasons, and in the light of the fact that Cece is a recently retired teacher from our district. Not to embarrass you, Cece, but Cece was a very gifted and very effective teacher throughout her career. She has just an amazing reputation, an opportunity to see her teach and see her effect on kids. So that your comment there is very powerful, very interesting.
Good point. Yeah, we got work to do is what I heard Cece say. That's what I interpreted is we got a lot of work to do, and it's not as easy as it sounds. And that's what I really appreciate about you all being here today is just the time to talk about this in process is important. And so here's what I want to do. I want you to stay in that space of just like the reflection of reimagining kind of how we lead in our school system, and be okay with a little non-closure right now, because this is not something we solve overnight. But I want to give you a visual and a connection to kind of where we go from here and just how you can reimagine. And then what does this look like in the governance space through your own reflection as an ongoing reflection as a team. And so one is, I think we have to reimagine who our kids really are, right? I think we have to kind of take those biases that we've been taught, right? As kind of these perceptions and stereotypes and narratives about who kids are, who families are, like the whole process of differences, and just reimagine them as human beings, okay? That there's no labels put on kids anymore, right? That we really have we have individual kids, as you all called out really well. And that Maslow's, I mentioned it earlier, right? It really ties into your vision statement, right? Is self-actualization at the top of the pyramid is the full potential of a kid. And how do we make sure that we just back up to make sure every single individual who comes through our school system has Maslow's? Like that's a great starting place when we're not sure where to start. Even with people may be resistant, I can't see that anyone would be resistant to the fact that every kid needs food, shelter, clothing, right? They need a safe place to be. If we can't even agree to that, then we just have some people who would just forever be non-believers, because this is about human work. Equity work is human work. I don't care what your test scores are. Every kid needs this. They need relationships. They need love. They need a sense of belonging. They need high self-esteem, that they feel good about themselves. That's all has to come before we call it, we got a Maslow's before we blooms, for those of us that are educators, right? We know blooms, right? And so what that looks like in the space as a governance team, what you want to envision this is through the lens of who our kids are. So I heard you say, I think Dr. Moss, you'd mentioned like seeing kids for who they are. What is our kids' cultural identity? What is their story beyond just the labels on the data that you all look at? I want you to think about how do we really focus on making school more relevant to children. Okay, that's so important, that kids' stories then is what helps us make it relevant. All kids are not the same, so we can't just have one delivery of support for children. It looks very different and has to be relevant. Relationships, again, I want to say is a no-brainer, but my goodness, if our kids don't have positive relationships, not only with staff, their teachers, you name it, but also with each other, right? Then we'll see really a lack of being successful, because we have human interaction is important. And if kids aren't feeling close relationships and connections, that really is a huge piece of the work. And those are questions we have to ask kids. What are your relationships? And the last piece is this, is we are in the business of educating children, no matter what. And yes, social emotional learning and looking at the whole child is important, but we are in the business of educating kids. That is a mandate, a moral imperative. And so rigor is important, academic rigor. And what I want to just couch that as, though, is it's not just about a lot of homework assignments. It's not about a lot of reading so many books, right? It's about high expectations. And what you all called out in your vision is challenging kids, right? That's what rigor is about. And it's about kids mastering those standards that you all expect of them. It's about meeting them where they are and making sure they're successful. And that's a re-envisioning of how we look at schools. Now, in the future, just to give you context, I actually have an equity walk tool that our team has developed some years back. And this would be an opportunity for you to think about in the future how you may want to have a chance to look in classrooms, right? As you think about the concept of equity walks, I've actually walked board members through classrooms to teach you how to look for equity beyond just what you see on the pretty data charts, right? It's very important to see kind of what I call the indicators of equity. Now, here is the piece that I want you to think about as we close out, okay? And I know we're making connections to the article, and I want to make sure that you have the tool in front of you that you can use throughout your time as a governance team for years to come. This is an amazing tool that board members can use to really look at ensuring that you have effective governance practices to advance your equity work. Okay, so you've all gone through like MIG trainings with CSBA, right? You've gone through workshops through the CSBA conferences, you name it. So just governance 101, right? Very important that we not forget to go back to that, just basic effective practices, which requires us to have discussions. And so this particular one is absolutely important. It has 8 characteristics of effective governance teams. And so in your packet, you have like the larger report that really shows the data and the research that the Center for Public Education did years back. This is back in 2011, still very relevant today. And what I did is adapted it to include that equity lens. So as you all review your work together, I'm sharing this tool with you to allow you to have some board study sessions that include intentional dialogue about where are we as a team in your own kind of self-assessment. How often do you all do your own board assessments? I know CSBA has a template and there's all kinds of ones that, that may be available. How often do you all do your own kind of board assessment in terms of governance?
Once a year.
Once a year. Okay. So what I would encourage you to do is to think about when you do study sessions, you do a lot of them on like particular topics, right? But carve out time to actually do your own study sessions around a lot of this piece here. What you see is the 8 characteristics call out like what we've spent a lot of time today purposely is talking about like shared beliefs and vision, right? And your real understanding of like how we educate kids. So the first 2 we kind of did today. And hopefully you're reflecting on like, where are we on our journey? Are we effective at that? Are we somewhat? Are we very? So having your own self-assessment. Okay, nothing that you need to take action on, but just having a discussion. And if you want to use this tool as your official tool, great. But this is a really helpful one to have you think about. Even number 3, having collaborative relationships, not only with your community, but also with the staff and with each other, ensuring that you really look at how we establish these goals collaboratively. And this is important. This is an important one. being accountability driven, having the data savviness. So I know you all look at data. Again, your team brings data to you all the time, but being savvy about it, meaning that you know how to ask those questions and dive a little bit deeper into the data to really better understand not just quantitative data, but qualitative data. And being okay with the fact that the data might not always be good, but we have to see that and be honest with ourselves so we can do something about it. Okay. And so we don't always want the data to just paint a pretty picture. We want to celebrate growth at all times. Okay. But I want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to really connect the work that you're doing as an equity driven team. And you've done that training. You've done it with Terrellyn, who's an amazing facilitator around really supporting governance teams. But as you add this equity lens, it's going to take that dynamic a lot deeper. And so you want to make sure you're really comfortable and feeling like you're progressing in this space, making sure that you are monitoring your resources, because your resources are important when it comes to aligning with LCAP, and also how you're making sure you monitor, kind of going back to what Mark said, like, how do we know, right? Like, how can we measure that? And so this is where you have to look at your budget. You have to look at people. You have to look at time. Those are all resources that even show up in your article, right? Around that. How do we really look at allocating so that it is absolutely equitable, that every kid and stakeholder is getting what they need? And of course, the last two are really interesting, because this is part of what you're doing today, is you're doing your united teamwork, right, with your superintendent. And you're doing that in a form of professional learning today. But everything you do around your equity-driven work has to be in unity with your superintendent and obviously with the staff. But creating your own level of trust, your own level of work together is going to require time. And so as you think about your self-assessment, you hopefully feel like you're on that somewhat to very effective level. And if you feel like you're ever not effective in any of these 8 spaces, that's where we pull out that study session time and say, you know what, I don't know if we're as data savvy as we should be. Lots of boards will say like, we're not as effective, maybe somewhat. So we might take number 5 and say, hey, we're going to have a study session. We're going to focus on data. And we're going to look at how do we unpack data so that we better understand the qualitative and quantitative data, and understand how do we reimagine student success? How do we understand the role of the state test versus our district benchmark, and have actual time to talk about that? Because if not, then when it's time to measure the impact of the work you're doing, the context you'll have will not be there. Even as former educators, I want to acknowledge a lot of you have been educators, right? So you know schools, right? But again, this is a different way of doing school. And so this requires time. And so this is why I really appreciate this assessment. Most critically, the last 3, which I shared with you earlier, right, is I want you all to think about where you are in the process of either evolving, drafting, or adopting your equity statement, your equity policy, as well as a plan. And so this assessment really helps us to figure out where are we in the process. And I want to just pause and see what thoughts you might have around how you may use this tool to help support reflecting on your growth as a team. Anyone want to jump in? Okay, I see a no. Okay. All right, so let me ask the next question. Okay, go ahead, Diane.
Well, it's just popping in as maybe we need to look at assessment tools for us on a more consistent basis rather than just a once a year culminating. I mean, just like we say we should be using a lot of different types of assessments as a teacher, we probably as adult learners should also be using more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And honestly, this work is different than any other work you'll ever have done. Mm-hmm. This is not like curriculum adoption. This is not like a lot of the technical work that is required to run a district. This is not an off-the-shelf program. I want to say that, right? There's not I'm selling you something. This is an approach and a mindset to your governance. So that's why it's important that you do spend time reflecting on learning together, but also how do we apply it? So I want to kind of bridge this last piece to application, if that's okay. And I want to make sure that you kind of, the article piece really connects to you. And if you want to have as you're getting ready, if you want to have page 4 in front of you, just the visual, I think is going to be really important as I bridge this last piece before we close out.
Nicole, can I just ask a quick question? Just kind of about this tool for us as board members, but then just kind of thinking about what the comment that Cece shared. In terms of personal biases. So So do you think that it would be, for us to, is there some way for us to look at our own biases in this tool? So like we're kind of doing it, through the lens of true, just a clear lens of equity, I guess. But
yeah, good question. Here's a tricky part. And this is something that's so interesting because this work is a little bit more complex for governance teams because you don't operate on an individual level, right? So part of this is we have to kind of do our own work on our own time, right? I think that's very important. But this is why days like today are really important. You get to learn together because one of the things we've been doing today is really what I call a debiasing technique in itself, is to allow you to constantly reflect and discuss, is an actual tool to help expand your exposure and awareness to some of the barriers, which sometimes we can be caught in because it's part of our blind spots. And again, remember, one of the other forms of barriers to this work is the fact that we have privilege, right? And power. And privilege and power means that I may not be impacted as harshly or as deeply as someone else. So I kind of don't have to be aware, right? And that's a blind spot in itself, that I'm not a kid in the system right now, so I'm not impacted. And that's not because we're bad people. It's just that's not our experience. So yes, Dr. Moss, absolutely. Unpacking our own biases. There's a lot that we need to do on our own individually. But remember, as I was transitioning this one slide, our roles are as a governance team. We're not individuals. So this is where we talk about what we do in public may look very different individually, but because we represent our team, we have to know our roles in this work. And our role is to govern through policy. We set the vision, we set the goals, we evaluate progress. And how we do that is impacted by our individual lens. And so that's why our own individual work has to happen. But remember also, the work we do as a team is really centered around working in conjunction with our superintendent to implement this work. So that's why it's important we learn together to have common vision, because now we ask our superintendent and staff to go implement and create a plan to do the work. And so as we're working together, we got to remember our roles in this work, right? And that's why I love this image here, because that dotted line is often the piece that will get blurred, because we'll start to what I call cross paths, and we'll think our role is to go and check out whatever. I think I mentioned this earlier. We'll want to check out some inequity at our schools and then come back, Dr. Young, this is going on in our schools, and I was over there. And then Dr. Young's going to say, remember that yellow slide that Nicole shared? Like our role, right? So when things happen, we discuss with each other and create a culture about how we're going to work together as a group versus individuals, right? This is a team. And so here's where we talk about what is our role. And our role is to work directly with our superintendent to ensure that the vision is clear, the direction is clear through what you've given, but also that you oversee from the policy level, you ask the questions, and then you allow your superintendent and staff to do the work. And you're always going to have, this is the other piece where Diane said we should look at our assessment more often, is this is what helps you remember that. And so I love the visual. One of my colleagues, you all met Deborah Keys Wright. She shares this often with boards around the nation. And it's really important to think about with your equity work. You got to make sure that you recognize, yes, you're individuals, but you're a team in this space. And so your equity work needs effective governance to really be effective. And then that's going to be critical. And it's a work in progress, by the way, right? We're going to mess up. We're going to bump our heads. We're going to make mistakes. And that's why we create a safe space to talk about it. Okay. Because again, you operate as a board. You don't operate as individuals. And that's always going to be hard because you each have a beautiful, amazing story that you bring to this. But then how do we do that collectively is why this is important. And so here's what I want to do. I want to close out with some final thoughts around, let me just get that image up. I got to find it, around your article, because I shared with you that story, the fish story, right? And part of what's going to happen, this is your non-closure as you come to a close, right? Is you're going to go, oh my God, there's never enough time to do this work, first of all. And that's okay. Like, it's non-closure. The work will continue though. And so as you look at that article and that inverted triangle, which I just said I was going to pull up so your community can see it, is that you're probably wondering, what do we do now? Okay, what do we do now? And so what I want you to think about is, one is, don't go and get too anxious and start changing a bunch of policies and start doing a lot of stuff. Okay, I always tell people, don't do a whole lot yet until you really have an understanding of what systems works look like, because you want your equity work to last. You don't want your work to just be like this year and next year and then it disappears, which is what we've seen in education a lot. And I think go back to Cece's comment about that lack of hope. We've seen this, Cece, right? We've seen a lot of initiatives come through the system. They last about 2-3 years and we throw them out because, oh, it didn't last. It didn't work. And this work is very different. And this is why I love this article, because it helps you see how with something as complex as equity in education, you got to see it from a systems lens if you want to make change. And you are the power structure. So you absolutely can make change, which is why I have hope and why I spend so much time with boards and educators. And this inverted triangle that you noticed in the article, right? And it kind of laid it all out. Notice, what do you see? You see different levels in the system that we have to address before we make decisions. And so I want you to kind of think of this inverted triangle as you continue to go through your policy work, and you're going to make some interesting decisions in the next couple of years that are going to have equity implications. Always look at it not just at the policy level, but how is it going to land in the trenches, right? You got to consider everything through this systems approach. So in closing out, I want to just see what closing thoughts you may have as you connect to kind of your next steps through this article. So I just want to allow that, and then Sherry, I know you have closing thoughts as president and Dr. Young as well. So I want to just kind of close out with final thoughts and connection to the work of system change as a governance team.
I don't know. I definitely love this article. I think that, I just think that we definitely have to be, we have to be open with our dialogue. And then we do have to include people in the conversation, all of those who are impacted in this system of education. That's how I see it. It's like, it just starts with some dialogue, some real dialogue.
Okay. Good call.
Yeah.
So I heard dialogue. That's a great one. Got to keep the dialogue going. Mark, what about you?
No, I agree with Dr. Moss. We just got to continue working at it, talk about it, and see, we're all 5 of us have different perspectives and coming together on that, But yeah, the article, the mental changing them, how you think about things, I really thought was big, and that is going to be the hardest part.
Yeah, you're right. That's the heaviest lift. Good call. Diane, any final thoughts?
Well, I got a few things going through my head. I think one of the most important things is the conversation. We need to make sure that we're having conversations, and that it's okay to have the conversations. And I think one of the things that's always really important is to understand the why and where it fits in or doesn't fit in.
Yeah.
Because I think we get hung up there sometimes as just because.
Yeah,
so I think that's important. And the other thing that was passing through, and I'm wrestling with connection, not connection, but kind of reflecting back on something that you and Cece were saying. There is a lot coming down right now from the state, and I think you're aware of it because you're working with CSBA with me as well as with AXA, where there, even though we are an LEA and we're supposed to be making decisions that are reflective of our needs of our community, they are looking to put more regulations on us. And I think we as governing board members need to start pushing back maybe a little more vocally, and saying, no, that's not a control that belongs to you. That's a control that belongs to us. And it's coming down. It's like, some of the reading I'm doing because I'm getting ready for one of our big rep meetings. So I would encourage my team, pay attention, because there's a lot of money potentially sitting there for us in education, and every penny is coming with a string. They're going to want something more from us. Some more evidence. So honestly, I'm wrestling with it. I know you're probably all going to shoot daggers, so I'll duck in a moment, but it's almost like, keep your money. Let us do what we know is best for kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just be aware of that as well. It's going to interfere and tie us again.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that perspective. And I know we're at the end of our time, and many of you need to move on to your day, but I just want to pause and Sherry, as I pass the virtual mic back to you, I just want to thank you all for taking the time today. It never is enough time, but the dialogue was rich today. I really appreciate you having the opportunity to just come together, sacred time, just to discuss. As many of you just said, we just got to keep discussing. I encourage you to continue to use the materials that were shared. I know Dr. Young will be in contact to talk about, what kind of you're looking at for your next school year and advancing your work. I really, am admiring. So just honored again to lock arms with you all and to do some amazing work together today, and just appreciate you all staying with the 4 agreements. You were engaged. I think all experienced some level of discomfort, right? Whether it's mental or just physical, because we're on Zoom for 3 hours. But literally you spoke your truth, which is important for you to do with each other. And of course, now we have non-closure. We haven't solved all the world's problems yet, but we're moving that way. And I am encouraged and I am hopeful. As Cece, I think we're hopeful. We're going to continue. But Sherry, I'll pass the virtual mic to you and just thank you all for your time. I admire your leadership. Thank you for your service. And for the community, I'll just share my information just to make sure that they have any information. And for each of you, if you need a resource or you need a thought partner, please feel free to reach out. Even outside of this meeting, I'm always available to be supportive, okay? So I appreciate each of you. And Sherry, I'm going to give the mic to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole. We really appreciate you being here. This whole session was very thought-provoking and brought a lot of things to the forefront that maybe we haven't all thought about. I wanted to ask if Dr. Young had any closing remarks before I close us out.
Thank you, President Zeta. I think those of you who spoke towards the end there captured my thoughts. I thought this was an incredibly fruitful morning, time well spent, really important work, big, complex stuff that we're going to need to keep coming. Like Mark said, we could keep coming back to it and doing it together. One of the things that Nicole reminds us of, because of the complexity of the work and to really change the system and move forward and getting into that stuff about mental models, there is an urgency around it. And the urgency, I think, is rooted in, not to sound contradictory, but, go slow to go fast. So this stuff will take root and really make a difference for our students. So I'm very enthusiastic about the conversation and the effort in influencing the way we do the work. So thank you. And then Ms. Zeta and I will, in her role as the board president, and she and I collaborate on, with board input, future study sessions and agenda items, et cetera. So she and I will get together and think about that too.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Again, Nicole Anderson, you are a wealth of information, and we really, really appreciate you being here with us. And I want to thank everybody that showed up this morning on a Saturday to be here. I know it's a long time, but it's well worth that we're doing it. So we'll move forward and make the best of it. So without further ado, I am going to close our meeting out. It is now 12:04. Have a great Saturday, you all, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.